All right, let's go ahead and get started our new work session configuration here. So thank you all for coming out this evening. Welcome to the July 15th, 2019 work session of the Falls Church City Council. Our first item is something that's been added recently, but I think is necessary and appropriate given the significant amount of flooding we've had in the city. Our assistant city manager is going to give us an update on what's transpired in the city and what the city's doing to try to take care of these issues and resolve them hopefully going forward. But I know it's going to be a longer term process. So Ms. Mester, you want to go ahead and get us started?
Certainly, Mayor. Thank you. And I'm joined this evening by Mike Whitfield, Director of Public Works, and also Alan Dalton, who is one of our civil engineers working on stormwater. So he's immersed in it on a day-to-day basis. So I thought it would be helpful to have them join us this evening. And this may be Alan's first formal council meeting at the table. So it was also, I thought, important for you all to meet him since this is such an important issue. So welcome to the new configuration. This will be the ultimate kind of layout. We're set up for joint with the Planning Commission, who will join us shortly. And of course, we still have some cables hanging from the wall, which will eventually be TVs, so that anybody in the room can see from different angles. And also we'll have the cameras up here for filming instead of the remote. So we're close to getting there, but not quite. So for this evening, we're just projecting on the rear wall so council can see. And so I appreciate for our two that are in the audience that they might need to turn a bit. So we have put together some few slides to try to give you a debrief from the storm perspective, where we were and where we're heading 1 week from the event, which was last Monday. And then also an update on where we've been in terms of our CIP for projects we've done with stormwater and a little bit on sewer, but then also some items in the code and compliance issues to kind of give you a big perspective. So there's some things here that are immediate, near term, and then long term as well. So as we know, July 8th, we had the flooding event. And during that event, when we looked at the different reports for how much rain fell, basically we're in the 3 to 3.5 inch rain in a very short time period. That 2 hours means we had a lot of rain all at once, and our systems became over capacity, as you all know, directly. This shows a picture of the rainfall in Northern Virginia, and actually we were not the highest nor the lowest, but certainly that was an intense amount of rainfall. Initially, we of course were in emergency response mode and did stand up the Emergency Operations Center so that we could have a coordinated response with city management, public works, and communications and public safety. So the key things were rescuing. We did have a citizen trapped in a house on Lincoln Avenue. Roadways blocked, of course, cars up to their axles. One car, as Mr. Shields reported, actually moved 30 feet. But we also had a hazmat response at Coleman Power Sports because their drains blocked and came back in, and so we had fuel and other hazardous materials. So the police, public works, and also the fire department need to respond there. And the picture that you see there is actually our crews in trying to unplug an inlet, because the reason it flooded is their stormwater inlet had been covered in mulch and other debris that floated right up to it. So in order to drain, which my understanding is it went pretty quickly once they freed it, they had to get in the contaminated water in order to do that. I wanted to touch base a little bit on sort of the FEMA federal response and state response in terms of funding assistance for public first, and then I'll talk a little bit about for private. In this case, the way the federal and state looks at it, public is local governments, not public citizens, as you all might consider our public. And then individual assistance would be the private homeowner and business. So to make it clearer, our emergency manager put the headers here for local government in red, and then blue will be for citizens. So in this case, as I said, public assistance is for local government, so we look at the parks, the building, the infrastructure of bridges, and so forth. For the city of our size, which is based on 2010 census data, we have to meet a federal threshold of just over 46,000. That will go up when the new census data is out. We must have declared an emergency declaration, which council is aware that the acting city manager did do, and you will ratify it on August 12th for the city of Falls Church. Yep. Low threshold for our population size. The Commonwealth, however, has to hit 13 million, and the governor must have declared an emergency declaration. So for the city, we did meet our threshold of the 46,000. Our current estimates are around 130,000, but we're still collecting data. And in fact, we'll have an engineer out tomorrow looking at 3 bridges, Oak Street being the biggest one because the road's still closed. Right now, we just have a very preliminary estimate in-house, and this will be confirmed by the structural engineer. I anticipate that dollar amount will go up, but we've met the threshold. The Commonwealth, however, did not meet its threshold. Arlington, Alexandria, and Fairfax did not hit, and us combined did not hit 13 million. It's a little over 6 million. So there was no declaration from the governor. So therefore, there's no federal declaration and no opportunity for reimbursement for the city from the feds or from the state for their normal emergency declaration funding. There is some available discretionary funding at the governor's level, and that has a slightly higher threshold of 49,000 versus the 46,000 that I showed you. We obviously still met that level. We do not know yet whether the governor will elect to use this discretionary funding. We're certainly advocating for it, as is Arlington, who had the largest amount of damage compared to Alexandria, Fairfax, or us. This is a map just to kind of give you the sense of the areas that were impacted. A lot in Ellison, as you all are aware, then over this part of Lincoln, and then you have over here, and then when we get down to Oakley and Cameron, the largest clusters where the water sources are, or historic low-level areas with basements. So not surprising, but we wanted to give you sort of a visual. And they're sort of gradiated, red being the major damage, and then down to structural assigned. This is still preliminary. We've done one field assessment, Public Works, Police, and VDEM, the Virginia Department of Emergency Management, last Thursday. Did an afternoon site visit to a lot of the affected properties. A lot of folks weren't home, they were at work, we're still getting emails, so this is just a preliminary sense. But I think it gives you a true picture of where the clustered issues are, and I'm sure they match the emails you've gotten or the texts and addresses that you've provided to staff.
Pause here for a minute.
Mm-hmm.
So blue, I think if I can read correctly, says floodplain. So there are
Yes.
a couple clusters that are outside of the floodplain, which is surprising. Are they just other low-lying areas in the city? Is there some characteristic in those areas that is concerning? Like, should the floodplain be expanded?
Let me pause and see if Mike or Alan want to join. I know Ellison is a historical area, and we've done a study in that area because of past flooding, but for the outside of floodplain areas?
It really depends on the topography over there. So when I say that, you don't have to necessarily be in the floodplain. If you're on the low side of the hill, the water begins at the top of the hill and comes down, it's going to collect down towards you. And that's kind of what we're seeing in some of these areas.
So let me ask you something. So, for example, on Columbia, which has a very big band of houses, which is not too far from my house, was that some sort of issue with like capacity of a pipe that essentially reached capacity and backflowed, or what happened there?
Well, all the streams, trips run, all the streams within the city that go through the city were full. So the water had no room.
Some of them were in pipes, right? So the pipe, when it reaches capacity, the banks of a creek can kind of pull up slowly up the side or whatever, but when a pipe reaches capacity, it's going to come up and basically go through the manholes.
Right, it just stages up and continues to go.
So what happened in West Columbia?
It had no water. So
Was it from a pipe or was that from actually a
Well,
creek?
we don't have that much of a piping network in the city. So we don't have that many inlets. We don't have that system that can collect all of this rain. So if it does have an opportunity to get to an inlet, that inlet's probably full. So it just floods the road.
So
Just your first person testimony on West Columbia, where my in-laws live. The water just surged up and smashed into the garage door, which is one of those downgrade driveways with a drain and then the garage door. So about a foot of water in the basement, and then in the garage, and then about 3 inches in the rest of the basement. First time since they moved there in 1960 that they'd ever had any water in their basement. And it was just the volume of it. The drain itself, once the rain stopped, was able to drain the water. The water didn't stay in the basement very long at their place, but it was just during that one brief 40 minutes more than, the design of the drain and the flow of the water was just more than it could handle.
Rush, yes.
Ed, Mike, just a couple questions for you. So first of all, the bridge on Oak Street, which is down closer to where Letty and I live, I see that it's blocked off. It's like the asphalt came off of the actual concrete structure itself. Is it closed down more because of the aesthetics of the asphalt being up, or is it truly structural damage to the concrete bridge itself?
So the preliminary assessment is, yes, the asphalt was washed away. I think there was some damage to the sidewalk, but looking underneath the bridge itself, the deck had actually separated from the girder.
That's what I figured.
So
Okay.
we didn't feel comfortable allowing traffic on, so we didn't close it.
Okay. And what's your estimate in terms of how long that's going to be closed down?
The bridge inspectors will be here tomorrow afternoon.
Okay.
They will inspect that and 2 other bridges, give us their evaluation. It's possible we could open it again, but if we did, it may be a one-way run.
Okay.
That's kind of the discussion. We may have to just block off half the bridge and utilize one part of it.
Sure. And are those bridge inspectors, where are they from? Is it like a third-party consultant, or is it somebody from
Well, it
FEMA?
is, it's one of our on-call consultants.
Okay.
And we used them last year, I believe.
So it's not a state or
Oh, no.
Federal,
These are
okay.
our
It's one of our structural
Got it.
engineers.
Got it. Okay. All right.
And as we know, this bridge was already limited in weight and was one that we've been applying for grants for and got
Yep.
turned down this last go-round. So once we have the assessment, then we'll have to make some.
Okay. Yeah, that is. I mean, historically, that area around Trips Run, we're on Seton Lane, so we're just outside of the floodplain. It's been an ongoing problem ever since we started having these massive rainfalls. And was this considered kind of a 100-year event?
100 plus probably.
So we've had what, 2 of those in the last 12 months, basically.
And in a moment, we'll go through some of the CIP projects and some of the staff that we've done and some of the staff recommendations going forward.
Do we have our representatives, like Dick Sassel and Marcus Simon, advocating on our behalf for those discretionary funds from the governor?
They are sort of on standby, but this was literally just determined late Friday, Monday
Got it.
morning. So
Okay.
us and our Northern Virginia peers, for whom they also represent, will be
Okay, good.
pushing it.
Okay. Last question for you at this point. That retention pond that we built, I don't know if you want to call it a rain garden or retention pond, that's at the end of West Cameron or Westmoreland?
Oh,
Westmoreland.
Westmoreland, yeah,
Yeah.
down by the park. How did that fare? And did that help in terms of potential flooding for those houses down in that cul-de-sac that's right up against Trips Run?
No, it was insignificant compared to the amount of rain.
insignificant in terms of,
Doing any attenuation,
so it didn't help very much?
no, not for the flood.
Okay.
That was more done for quality than quantity, and this was definitely a quantity event.
Got it. Okay, I didn't know if something like that would be effective in other places. I mean, you talked about inlets, but these types of retention ponds, again, I'm not a civil engineer, but if we don't have, the proper infrastructure in terms of pipes, are there things like that we could do that would help collect that water in the event that streams overrun pipes that we do have, or
I have some information that will include, but things like private laterals where people haven't maintained and the inflow and infiltration into our system, sump pumps and roof drains would make a significant difference into our capacity, and then looking at inlets and other stuff, but
I think that'd be
There's
really
other
helpful.
factors.
We've been battling it at our house for quite some time, and we're doing a renovation now, which includes grading and drainage to deal with stormwater, and we're doing everything that we can, rain gardens, proper drainage. I would like to know from the city's perspective what residents can do to help mitigate some of the problems. And you talked about Coleman Power Sports. I can imagine things clog up those pipes. I personally would like to know what residents can do to help mitigate some of that, to make sure that they don't cause kind of hyper-local backups where they are. So
I've made a note for that. We'll cover some of that, but then we can certainly
Okay.
circle back to that
But
point.
If I might, Cindy, since we're on the mitigation side, a couple suggestions. So I've always avoided talking about insurance because I work there during the day, but the fact of the matter is that people need to start buying insurance when they're outside of the floodplain to reflect the climate realities. And again, I'll just leave it there. If there's something that the city can do to suggest people at least think about that, they should do that, number one. Number two, I find this whole conversation incredibly frustrating. This is literally happening all over the country. And it's because decisions have been made at the federal level to do absolutely nothing to deal with climate change. And all the costs now are passed on to the state government, and the state government in turn passes it on to localities, and localities in turn impose it more on their citizens. So I gotta say that there's probably no amount of money that we can reasonably invest at this point, either as individuals or as a city, that's going to make up for the climate change that's occurred as a result, in part, of national and international policy. I just have to get that out there because, yes, we should do what we can do, but the origin of this issue is not with us, and ultimately the responsibility for resolving it should not totally be on our shoulders. I just wanted to get that out and say that. But and with regard to these driveways, these nearly vertical driveways, we had to get rid of ours because we were starting to get flooding. It cost a lot of money, but we had to mitigate in order to get rid of that because under today's climate situation, never mind what the city does or doesn't do, the reality is that's no longer something that works very well. So, we're on this pre-event situation, and I do think the larger sense is that that we're paying the price for decisions that have been made irresponsibly elsewhere, and I don't want to let them off the hook, even as we do what we can do as a community and as individuals. Thanks.
Why don't you continue on with your
So related to that, so given that we had flood, can we go back to the map? Given that we had flooding outside of the floodplain, what is the process, and should we actually investigate expansion of the floodplain? So we clearly have a lot more flooding happen outside of the floodplain.
Floodplain maps are being updated. It's not necessarily driven by us, but
Is that
could
data
one of
that
you
we can
two
provide to
respond more
whoever-
specifically?
FEMA notified us about.
Can you turn the microphone towards you? It's a little unidirectional.
Push that? FEMA notified us about 3 months ago that they had started to remap the city, and they gave us the programs that they were going to use for it, but they didn't give us any data in terms of whether or not in terms of what rainfall information they were using. The expectation would be it's going to get bigger, not smaller, but that's all we know for now. So we certainly can map our own floodplain for tributary areas less than FEMA's threshold for it. Fairfax does it for anything under a square mile and anything under 70 acres tributary area. But I don't know that that gets you federal insurance for it.
So what are the implications of that if the floodplain does expand? Does that mean that more homeowners will be required to get flood insurance? Does that mean that we get more funding on the positive side because we have a bigger area within our jurisdiction as floodplain? What does that mean?
I think it means more homeowners subject to having flood insurance.
That's mandatory
means-
though, right? When they expand the
It
flood.
means lenders will require you to
Right.
carry flood insurance as a condition of giving you the loan. That
Yeah.
doesn't mean, however, that should determine people's decision whether to buy that or not, considering the new climate conditions where you're having massive flooding outside of any redefinition of floodplain.
So the floodplain just makes it mandatory.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
But I think it also, correct me if I'm wrong, restricts what you can do as a homeowner as far as additions and things like that. So it can be very restrictive to homeowners.
Speaking of restrictives, so we started talking about mitigation. One of the most common, I think, when I walked around in the emails and texts that I got, one of those common factors I've seen from a lot of the flooded houses were just those downsloping driveways that Phil's in-laws had. Are those still allowed from a planning perspective? Like, can people build houses with driveways that essentially aim water towards a house? Like, that seems, is that just a carryover from what we used to allow, or do we still allow new houses to be built that way?
I think as we go forward, Public Works staff is looking very closely at grading plans and how things are flow and how we're managing stormwater, and that's also in partnership with the planning. A lot of those houses are obviously from our early post-World War II development. We're not going to allow for direct flooding into basements. And some houses, you know, if in floodplain, the basement's not.
Yeah, because
gonna
on
be
Lincoln, for
permitted
example, I
either.
just drove by Lincoln earlier. There are a couple of brand new houses, less than 10 years old, that has a driveway that slopes into their downstairs garage. And something built within the past 10 years that just does not seem like a wise grading plan. So I guess definitively, I'd like to know, do we allow it? And then if so, why? And maybe that's something that we should look into changing. I can't imagine a homeowner wanting that if they now have experienced this.
Yeah, Director of Planning, so why don't you get to a mic, Jim?
Might be easier to go that way because I have the rack, Jim. And I will say this is something also that I think will need some internal follow-up as after action because things have changed just in that 10-year period.
Sometimes you have people also with height issues, so you don't want to have if you had it right at grade, your roof height might be high. But anyway, Jim, what do you think?
I would just say, in terms of what the zoning requirement is, you only are required to have one off-street parking place. So the choice to have a garage or one that has a driveway that goes into a garage that's part of a basement is a choice people to make. It's not a good choice if you've got the kinds of conditions we're talking about. But we aren't requiring more than one off-street parking place per single-family house. So this is...
I'm hearing that people can still build houses that way.
They can build it, but one of the questions is it a good plan to do that? The other thing I would mention is we have been talking for some time about trying to use the state's power of transfer of development rights as a way to possibly begin to buy up properties that have this condition that are in floodplains and begin to turn those into areas for streams rather than perennial flooding. And this is not an easy thing to do, but there are ways to transfer that density to someplace else that doesn't flood. And it is a power the state gives us. Arlington County bought up lots of houses along 4 Mile Run that are now either gardens or park area years ago because they couldn't stop the problems of 4 Mile Run flooding. This has been decades ago, but it has been very helpful. So that's something.
All right.
Thank you, Mayor. So touching base on some assistance to homeowners, because I know you're getting some questions, and then we'll transition into capital. This is from the state and federal level, this is called individual assistance, or IA, separating it from our public assistance. There can be low-cost loans from the Small Business Administration, and I'll highlight it's loans. It's not a grant program, but it is low cost. A locality must have more than 25 affected homes that are major loss and essentially impacts the operations of the building. It's a pretty tight definition of major. It's not just flooding a basement a couple inches. So it's usually a 4 to 5 feet depth. It's going to impact your water heater, your electrical circuits, maybe your HVAC. So it has to have some essential impact to the living space. Sometimes just a finished basement doesn't meet that threshold. And a jurisdiction can qualify if we touch another locality that qualifies, for example, Arlington. So for the City of Falls Church, we have less than 10 homes that meet that threshold. Arlington, however, did meet their threshold of 25 homes, and they have a meeting this week with SBA, so we'll find out the next steps. So by Arlington qualifying, the City of Falls Church homeowners will qualify, but once again, it's not automatic in that you have to meet the definition of major impact, essential impact to living space. But once we have some more information following up with the Arlington, we'll be able to message and do some outreach local.
So aren't there income qualifications for that, though? It's not just damage, right?
Yeah, so that's what we're also getting the details from SBA.
So typically it's restricted to lower income. So not even, okay.
But I don't have those specific details yet. This was just determined after the VDM was here last week for both Arlington and us. Some of the after actions that we are following up from the immediate storm response is that our Office of Emergency Management and VDM will be convening our local teams to do an after actions lessons learned from the immediate in the street into recovery. We're also training city staff, because we have a lot of new staff on Web EOC and the new state system called Crisis Track, where we can actually enter the data in for locations that are being impacted, automatically feeds into the state. We're going to review our operations procedures, communication, and determine what else we might need to do for training. We were not fully set up in the main EOC for this building, which is the downstairs Laurel. So we'll do some tabletop exercises when we get the computers, phones, and screens up in there. So we have CNN, Web EOC. The Crisis Track is a really good system for collecting data, and it's predominantly provided for the localities use, and it's free to the localities. Several of you heard and sent inquiries about the public online opportunity that Arlington and Fairfax did. They were using Crisis Track, but they have to pay for that. So right now, and also Arlington had a lot of problems with what was being entered. Was it clear enough? They had to go back and work with citizens. So right now, as part of our after action, we will also be assessing some of their lessons learned for that tool, and whether it's a cost benefit for us or a internal system of just collecting the data and consolidating in the Web AOC will work best. Additionally, as you know, we did some recovery efforts in terms of the permits are required still for electrical and plumbing and so forth, gas, but the fees are waived. Special bulk collection, the fees were waived for our contractor, and they're scheduled to pick up through the 17th. It was indeed a large amount of stuff, and several citizens didn't have stuff picked up because the trucks were just full for us and our neighboring jurisdictions. So Public Works crews are actually going to continue pick up after Wednesday till next Monday with our staff going and picking up and running to the landfill to dump. We do ask that citizens only put out flood-related damaged materials, because that is what is waived. Everything else, please call the number and schedule your $65 pickup. These expenses are unbudgeted. It's been, when you have storms like this, you can't predict that. So we are going to be closely looking at the Public Works budget for this contract and their staffing. And that is not in our impacted cost to date of that $130,000 that I mentioned earlier. It will probably be something we'll have to visit with the city manager and council as we go through the year. We've mentioned already the Oak Street Bridge. That's the main inspection. We do have 2 pedestrian bridges that will also be inspected tomorrow. We are starting to take the mapping data and the addresses that we've shared with you before, and our GIS specialist is entering this data so that we can cross-reference it to the watershed management plan, but also known flooding areas for future follow-up. That assessment will help us guide future CIP and operational programs going forward. A little bit on the stormwater in particular for past capital projects. This is a sample of pictures where you can see corroded pipes where we've been working on the relining. This is a picture of the Oak Street Bridge where we talked about earlier with the pavement coming up, sidewalk collapse and debris. This is a 4-mile run conceptual picture that we can look at for future ways to remediate issues. And then this is the Crossman Park stream restoration and daylighting that certainly help manage quantity and long-term quality. So a couple of things that are underway already, and I think just reinforce the importance of it. This storm, as we go forward, is, as we will talk about 2 chapters tonight with the Joint Planning Commission work session. We need to keep working on the environmental chapter and bring that back to Planning Commission and Council. That's really critical for energy, solid waste, and trees, of course, but also the stormwater is pretty critical within that too. The goals would be to help reduce the runoff, which gets us the quantity. We need to improve quality, and then the green space and trees can help slow down and absorb. And so while Westmoreland didn't have a big impact, if you have a lot of those and more rain gardens and detain on site for the residential houses that Alan's seeing grading plans for, we can make differences. And then, of course, the comp plan, as our others do, have strategies and actions. So some of the things that you mentioned tonight and some of the staff items that I'll mention shortly can be things that we can target in that planning document. That, of course, helps also drive your CIP. Watershed management plan is another area that is primed for update. That was done in 2012. We've had quite a bit of changing conditions in the city since then, whether it's redevelopment of houses, big economic development projects, and as Mr. Snyder mentioned earlier, climate change. So I know it's something on Alan and Mike's desired to-do list. There were 45 projects in that plan when it was adopted with criteria that helped us select future projects. I think those criteria need to be reassessed based on the changing conditions. And those projects range from big to small: flooding, water quality, rain spouts that are causing icing out on the street when the water runs out, for example. So this would be primed to be part of the comp plan strategies and actions for updates, and also a chance to look at solutions. So we're making sure, as Mr. Whitfield has indicated to me, we're looking at basins and areas of water in and outside of floodplains and not targeting 1 or 2 houses, but having a cost-benefit, larger impact.
Cindy, pausing here. So I think this is what you meant by earlier when you said we're going to do the GIS mapping of the impacted areas versus kind of the projects we have. But are these still the right 10 or 45 stormwater projects that we should be doing? And if they are, does that mean that they'll fix the issues we had last week as well as previous storms? And if they're not, what are the right projects and how much do we need to invest?
I would say for quantity, these are probably not the right projects because a lot of them deal with quality, but we probably have some new priorities. And I'll let Mike and Alan add, but this is a sample of the report that Alan provided me for a quick update of the top 10 that were in your watershed management plan. So there was 45 projects, but there were 10 that came to the top. The City Hall campus is completed. That one and the tennis courts really made a big difference on Great Falls. Yeah.
They still got flooding down.
We still got flooding, but compared to what it was, we do have quite a few. Wren's Branch is a small one. It's in design. A lot of these are not done yet. Westmoreland is the one that was mentioned earlier. We've done a lot of daylighting with Harrison Branch, Berman, and Howard E. Herman, and I think that has helped in those areas. but a lot of these projects are not going to handle that quantity in a short period of time. Alan and Mike, anything to add to Ms. Hardy's questions, and then we'll come back to council.
For example, the East Columbia North Underwood project that has been on the books forever, that would have been designed for a 10-year event, and we had a 100-year event. So it would not have solved that problem. It would have solved it for lower storms. That sort of summarizes the issue everywhere, that traditional design is for the 10-year event, and you get something bigger than that, and the water flows into the street, always has, flows over land into the streams. So do we need to bump up our design to 25-year event? But the drawback is the existing system really doesn't handle the 10. Perhaps it handles the 2.
So my question further to Ms. Hardy's, I look at this list and how many on this list address issues where that dotted map that you had earlier related to this event, where it would actually make a difference in those areas that are heavily impacted?
All of the ones that say tree box on it primarily were water quality improvements, permeable pavers, tree boxes to treat some amount of water, and minor drainage improvements. So the water quality was important, but actually we're in pretty good shape. Water quality, we're going to meet our next round of phosphorus, we're going to meet nitrogen, we're going to be short on suspended solids. So perhaps it's the time to shift to water quantity improvements.
I guess, yeah. So it looked like that was the case, that you're looking at filtering water, right? More than you are looking at actually retention or dealing with it. And from my standpoint, if we're doing this planning back in 2012, which is probably based on events and data from even earlier than that, and we're worried about the quality of the water, you look at a Coleman Power Sports, we can build all the tree boxes that we want, but you have one event like a Coleman Power Sports that floods oil and petroleum products all into the streets, and then we can do all that we want from a filtering perspective, and we basically negated that. If that's what's going to be the standard going forward, I'd rather see something done from a larger perspective in the areas that we need it, as opposed to little ones around the city, because we've got really major problems down there in Trips Run, and if this has become the standard because of climate change, then we need a big effort in maybe smaller quantity, as opposed to some of these smaller solutions in larger quantity across the city. So I for one, I think to where Ms. Hardy was headed, would like to revisit that and see where we can make those investments in stormwater. They're going to have the most impact in the areas that need it, as opposed to this, not to denigrate it, but kind of the ticky-tack stuff that sounds good, because it sounds like we're in a good spot. One 100-year storm can negate all the water filtering in the world.
I think if you think about the 2012, which was earlier data, there was a lot of regulation and community focus on quality. Certainly what we've been experiencing, and that's to the point where we need to redo the watershed plan and look at those issues, not just updated for the next round of projects. I think it needs a holistic review, and that's the expertise that staff can bring to the table for you.
Great.
So those were some projects that were funded either CIP or grants or a combination. For this current fiscal year, we have $1 million of debt service appropriated in the CIP, but currently the amount of money to pay the debt service when we issue that debt would mean that we can issue about $600,000, and that will be in the next debt issuance. In the next years of the CIP, staff is recommending, and it is adopted, to be doing $1 million in FY21 and then bump up to $1.5 million, and you're going to need that to continue some of our public infrastructure. Based on the watershed management plan, those may be low. That was based on the update. This was based on the previous one. Certainly we need to continue our investment in our relining and looking at the quantity and quality, but the quantity is where our issues are right now. We will need to do a rate study. Right now, it does not look like the rates that we're charging will allow us to handle that, or we need to look at grants or some other funding sources. And we need to make sure we have the staffing needs to manage these projects and actually deliver them as well. So I think as we do the comp plan, the watershed management plan, and this next CIP, this is a big part of what staff will be working on to present to council.
Cindy, let me rephrase that because I think I heard you signal that we may be increasing the stormwater fee to fund kind of more projects. Is that right?
That would be one way to do it. I think we need the rate study to justify the needs and what that rate would be. The City of Falls Church does have one of the highest, if not the highest, stormwater rates, so I think that's a pretty significant discussion, policy discussion. That's why I also put out there whether there's another dedicated funding source or if there's any grants out there that we could also try to supplement.
I guess two big inputs I'd like to have before that discussion is one, this updated project list we just talked about. So if this is not the right set of 10 or 45 projects, if it needs to be 50 projects or 5 really big ones, whatever that is, I'd look to staff to be the experts on that. I'd like to look at that and understand how impactful those are. And I think the second piece of information is I'd like to understand for the current stormwater fee that we charge, how much of it is operations versus capital, and then have that benchmarked against our neighbors to know how efficient we're doing against those projects. Because I think that'll help inform whether we should be raising the rate or looking for other sources. But clearly a timely and important discussion.
I think a rate study as well as the update to the watershed management plan would be able to provide you that data, because otherwise you're having a discussion in the vacuum.
Great, thank you.
One last question for you guys, and Jim, Mike. If there was one thing that we could do based on the way that the city is designed, so to speak, and the challenges that we're faced with, so one kind of big project that we could do to help hopefully mitigate some of these, whether it's daylighting, targeted basins, retention ponds, if it's changes in zoning, if it's there was one kind of shot in the arm that we could undertake, what would that be, in your opinion? Cost aside, Mike.
Cost aside, I was about to say there's probably nothing that we can afford to do.
Okay. Okay.
There's no way that we can attenuate.
Okay.
I would say there are more than one thing, but I think it's possible. You can do some detention of thanks, Mike. You can do some detention of whatever is coming off that lot, slow it down. That's one thing that's helpful to be done house by house. And it's not that big of a cost for those folks. I think another potential is where we still have large surface parking lots and we have places where those are being redone. If we were able to partner with some of those places and create large detention areas underneath it with permeable paving, that might be a cost-effective partnering. We have Columbia Baptist, which is going for the Plan Commission with reworking of their park surface lot. We have the schools are going to build a new surface lot. These are areas that could, I don't know the numbers, so you'd have to do how much quantity, but a totally impervious surface lot makes no sense in the situation right now. So is there a way to partner with those to add retention, detention as a part of that, either through design or, there are designs that do that. The library in Alexandria that was built not too long ago off Duke Street was designed to, hold water and still park cars.
Yes, Mr.
So to follow up on that point that you made, so what's the best way to make that happen? Is that an administrative function? I'm talking about, more assertively addressing stormwater quantity when we build new houses. Is that something that can be handled administratively by your folks, or is that something council needs to enact language on? I've heard, even before this storm, we were beginning to talk about this because of very localized situations with large houses that appear to be draining off into their neighbors' basements. This just brings us into higher relief. Is there something we need to do to empower you to act on that?
So I believe that would be a change to the city code.
Okay, well, I had a feeling that might be the answer.
And I've put up a slide here. I've jumped ahead to the end, but I'll let Alan speak to it because there are some things that we can do with the existing code, and then I'll come back to some things where we might want to make some changes.
And it's also, we need to wrap this discussion up fairly soon.
Yep. These are my last 2 slides, so if
All
we
right.
can get through them. So let me have Alan add to the current code.
City code mirrors the state code. In 2014, everyone had to adopt the same regulations. You could exempt single-family houses from it. The city did not. So we have some leeway in the enforcement of it. And the city has been basically waiving the requirements for on-lot detention for small increases in runoff. And in most of the redevelopment projects for single-family houses, it's about 1/10 of a cubic foot per second, relatively small amount. And the policy, at least for the last couple years, has been that if that increase can go into the right-of-way, into the city system, into a storm drainage system, not sheet flowing into the neighbor's yard, then we would accept that. But the actual code is different from that. So we can make that change immediately. And I've been warning the engineers and builders for 6 months that we weren't going to continue on this path forever of waiting.
I think that's important because that's going into our capacity, and that's small amounts add up in a big event like that.
So why don't you maybe, I think tonight we probably need to wrap up, but why don't we plan in the immediate future to have a discussion about that idea and what we might need to do, if anything, to implement that?
I think with the code and the updates to the comp plan, because we can look at, we've had conversations before about changing the code about not allowing some pumps and roof drains, the grandfather ones to continue, new ones not. So we can look at that. And I just want to highlight quickly on the sanitary sewer, because that was part of the issue too. It wasn't just stormwater through this event. The sanitary sewer system got to capacity because of inflow of water into our manholes and water sitting on the roads. And when that was at capacity, then some folks got a mix of sewer and stormwater backing up. Our main lines are in good condition because of the relining. We need to keep that going, but I think we will need to look at some things like manhole cover changes, but also we'll need to work, residents need to look at their laterals and some pumps and rain drains. So there's some things there that we can circle back with council on.
Okay, Mr. Snyder?
So, so my question is, if we did all this, what would change with a 100-year storm? And I think before we start down the road, we need to get a sense of that, which gets back to a comment I made a few minutes ago, which is this problem was created at a very different level of government, which has absolutely refused to address climate change. The net effect is that the negative impacts flow literally downhill, if I could use that, to localities. And so we're talking about imposing significant new requirements on both commercial and residential. And the question is, if we did that, would it still make any real difference? You don't need an answer to that tonight, but what I'm really interested in is what will really make a difference. And I suspect that even if we did all this, the 100-year storm that we had would still would have caused major damage. And so even as we do what we need to do at the local level, I refuse to accept that this is a problem that we created or that we alone try to solve.
All right, let's wrap this up, Mr.
I just
Snyder.
would say, I mentioned the transfer of development rights. We have a lot of houses built in areas that are in floodplain, and they're going to continue to flood. And so if long-term we were able to create some funding that would create a revolving fund that could allow those houses to turn into open space without it being a hardship on the property owners, those are going to flood again and again and again, and at some point, 50 years from now, you shouldn't have houses in those locations. And I've been here 8+ years, and we're on, there are consistent problems in those flood areas.
Okay.
We want to wrap up. So I agree with Mr. Snyder that a large part of this needs to happen at a bigger federal level, but I think given that we've seen data in the past that we disturb far more land each year in our residential neighborhoods than we do in our commercial, I think there is clearly a part that we should do. So I would love to have the discussion on, let's make sure we start enforcing the code that we have. So let's stop waiving, the off-site credits and let people do it on-site instead. So I'd like to see that happen. Similar to, I guess, this, which probably OCOM put out, I think we should capitalize on, I guess, the momentum from the storm that people want to act. Are there tips that we could offer to homeowners to help them with grading? Consider putting in pervious gravel driveways, using rain barrels in their gardens, putting rain guards. I feel like we have a lot of tips out there. It might be a helpful guide we could just issue city residents who had, may not have significant damage, but had enough flooding and, water around their houses. They want to do something about it, because I do think every bit helps, and if every homeowner did a bit of something, that could help the neighborhood. So I'd like to make that request. Thank you.
All right, I've got a few
noted.
comments. One, I think we really need to find a way to accelerate these solutions. You know, when your house floods, and I did have some flooding in my house, but not nearly as much as I think a lot of other folks did, but it creates uncertainty. So even if your house doesn't flood for the next 10 years, you don't know every storm whether it's going to or not. And these 100-year events seem to be happening every year. And so I think we need to change also how we plan. And maybe it's going from a 10 to a 25, as you said, 25-year flood event. But I think we need to reconsider and reevaluate what benchmark we're working towards, because it seems like, as we all, I think, seem to acknowledge, the world's changing, climate's changing, and that's having an impact here in our city. I do also think that interest rates are very low right now. I don't think that I know that. Interest rates are very low, and it may be a time for us to consider accelerating some of these capital improvements we may need to make. And again, I would focus, as we've heard, on quantity, not so much quality. But I think there very well may be some bottlenecks in the city where there are pipes, and one of them runs through my yard, that overflowed, that basically was at capacity and was shooting water everywhere. And I'm not suggesting that's one of our priorities, but I think there are places like that in our city that we ought to be looking at. And I think it's a good time with low interest rates to consider borrowing and spreading out the cost over time. I do think, too, the cost of flooding is it's catastrophic for people. You know, when your basement floods, if you got kids, you worry about mold. You know, there may be precious memories in your basement that are gone forever. It's just a really serious thing, and there's a whole bunch of people in this city who I think are really hurting from this last event. And I remember the one before that was only a year ago, it seems, that we had a very similar event. And so I think we really need to accelerate solutions and really try to work as best we can to get some quick solutions to these problems. So anyway, I guess I would ask our assistant city manager is maybe we can have another update in the very near future about some possible things we talked about tonight, code changes, et cetera, but also reevaluation of our priority list of projects, what needs to go, what needs to come on, and how we might consider paying for those things, whether that's debt financing, whether it's fee increases, or whatever it might be. But I think this is something that needs to have our prompt attention.
Staff will be glad to follow up.
All right.
I think they're aligned with you.
All right, thanks. All right, everybody. Cindy, are you going to be taking the lead on this presentation, or who is?
I am going to have the honor of deferring over to Shayna to do that. And we still have Jim in the audience, and of course our consultant who's been helping through all this process. And thank you, Planning Commission, for joining us. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, and then I'm going to try again to get the document open for you.
Well, first, I just wanted to thank you all for accommodating the joint work session tonight. It's helpful from a staff perspective to be able to have these conversations occurring, hearing both council's feedback and Planning Commission at the same time, of everybody at the table. So I wanted to just quickly touch on the process for the demographics chapter, and then open it up for discussion. So council last saw the demographics chapter on June 17th. And then after that, the chapter was presented to the Planning Commission on July 1st. And so there were a number of changes that occurred to the chapter after the June 17th City Council work session. In the demographic trends section, there was an acknowledgement that the increase in the stock of studios and one-bedroom units has been one factor that's contributed to the increase in the number of people living alone within the city. In the connections and strategies section, the paragraph under housing affordability was revised to be more clear. Additionally, some text was added to emphasize that the half-mile circle map highlights opportunities for residents to walk or cycle to their destinations. So just more clarity with that paragraph. The public facilities section was revised to also discuss public services, and a strategy was added to discuss planning for public safety needs and as population increases. And then following the July 1st Planning Commission work session, there were no changes that were needed to be made to the chapter. And so the planned schedule with this chapter is to hold the joint work session tonight, make any additional refinements to the chapter based on feedback that staff hears, and then come back to Planning Commission on August 5th, and then be back at City Council for consideration of the draft chapter on August 12th. And so that's all that I had for the staff report, but I'd like to open it up for discussion.
All right, thank you so much. I know there's been a lot of public involvement, a lot of hearings and discussions, and so we greatly appreciate your leadership on that. Should we start maybe with Planning Commission to see what your thoughts are, Mr. Wodiska? Or?
Well, let me open it up to the planning commissioners, see if we have any comments. We've obviously had work sessions like City Council and seen these demographics before. Really, at this point, it's just seeing how it's being presented here in the report. And, heard what the changes were and up to speed on those. I don't know if people on the commission have any real comments about this. We've had lengthy discussions about it and the impacts and how it will guide our comprehensive plan. But anyone have any comments?
I mean, we did this 2 weeks ago at our meeting and gave our comments. My main thing coming out of it was, of all of the chapters that probably should be updated more often than other chapters, this is one of them, just because demographics change. So my main comment was, can we get this on, at least the key parts of this updated more frequently than whatever 15 years something it's been since it was last take crack at it. But otherwise, I think it's straightforward and obviously leveraged a lot in the thing we're going to talk about after this, the housing chapter, which is something we have had less exposure to.
I'll just make a quick comment. We have worked through this a lot and we've had a lot of different input on it. But I think the thing that's really telling in the demographic chapter and something we need to think about in the future is this trend where most of us work outside the city at higher paying jobs, and most of the people who work in the city come from outside the city at very lower paying jobs. So I think that we've done a good job in terms of some of the demographic shifting we've done, where we have a lot more young professionals, a lot of these single family households that we didn't have that kind of housing before. But maybe one of the things we need to really focus on in the future is maybe some kind of looking at the amount and types of jobs we have in the city itself.
Thank you.
I would just add to that, the Chamber's comments I thought were very spot on that whole point on the need to have more office buildings. I say office building here as a way to kind of address that asymmetry, which I think you're talking about. So actually having the jobs that people want here in the city is good not only from a housing standpoint, but it's good for economic development, which is pointed out here, and it's good for the environment as well, so that we truly are a walkable community. People don't have to drive in their cars as much. So those things can all be interrelated. So just maybe slightly better.
Okay, other comments, thoughts, questions? Council, do you guys have some questions or comments, either for our Planning Commission friends or Ms. Hardy?
I was going to add the corollary to that is, so that I really like that word you talked about, asymmetry between the people who live here and work here. So we said add more office so that we create jobs for the people who live here. And the corollary to that is clearly need to add more housing for the people who work here as well. So that might be a good segue to the housing chapter. But that's the connection I wanted to make to that.
All right. Other comments, questions? Okay. Well, that's pretty straightforward. Why don't we move on to the next section then on housing, which I think will probably be a little bit more vigorous discussion.
All right, and Nancy, I don't know if you want to come up. We have a chair here in case there's questions or comments. And once again, shall I just turn it over to Shayna so we can be efficient on timing?
Sure. All right, so again, I just want to give a very brief overview of the process with this chapter since the council last saw it, and then highlight some of the changes and then the timeline. And so with this chapter, it last came before City Council on June 17th. At that council meeting, council directed staff to convene a work group to discuss further refinements to the draft chapter. And also, since that time, staff also presented the draft chapter to the Housing Commission, and so we got further feedback from them that was helpful to getting the draft that you all have before you tonight. So the plan for this chapter, again, is on the same schedule as the demographics chapter, looking to have the joint work session tonight, bring it back to Planning Commission on August 5th, and then have it come back to City Council on August 12th for consideration. And so with that, I'm actually going to turn it over to Councilmember Hardy, who has been instrumental in helping refine the draft chapter, and she's going to highlight some of the changes that have occurred since Council last saw the document.
Great, thank you. So before I jump in, I wanted to thank Ms. Schaefer and Ms. Mastern for being so receptive to feedback. I know we've had many turns of this document, and so this has really been rehauled. If you look through the draft chapter, it's in red line, and you can see the amount of just red text there is. So it's really been updated. So thank you for being so responsive and open to the feedback with me and also the Vice Mayor who sat in a lot of these. I'm not going to go through the details because I think hopefully everyone's read them, but I wanted to take the opportunity to call out a couple big kind of hopefully calls to action for us as a council and planning commission. The housing vision has been updated to kind of more welcoming language, so hopefully everyone's more comfortable with that compared to where we were a month ago. The history section as well, I think the Vice Mayor had some concerns around the way we were phrasing the evolution of the city's housing stock. And so the thing I'll point out there is I think staff's done a nice job talking about both the quality changes, so loss of some historic homes, tear downs, renovations, as well as the quantity. So the very intentional, deliberate strategy to add multifamily there. One thing I wanted to note on within the history page is actually the prices for the City of Falls Church. So it's on page, Shane, if you have it, the thing I want to call it is basically we are median prices. Figure 10-6, page 8. Not only do we have the highest median prices for the area, but we also have the largest jump. So kind of something that everyone knows, but I wanted people to really stare at that figure because I think that's pretty telling. Moving on to the affordable housing section, this has changed a lot since we last looked at it as a council, and it's been really reorganized. The thing that we've been really talking about a lot is actually the expiration of the fields, but what I asked staff to actually add in is actually the expiration of all of our affordable housing. So figure 10-7, which is a new chart in there that shows all the, you can't see it up there that well unless we can zoom in, but it shows all the projects we have across the city. And while we're very focused on 2026 being the expiration of the fields, what everyone should actually pay attention to is we have a whole bunch of other housing that's gonna expire. So while fields clearly is significant, being a third of our committed affordable housing, everything else is gonna expire too. And that should be a big wake up call for us. So hopefully people stare at that because not only have we lost a ton of market rate housing, which we can't really control because frankly it's just gotten more expensive to live in the region, the committed ones, which are ones that we either have negotiated at 6% as part of our voluntary concessions, pretty much everything else is going to expire in the next 10 to 15 years. And we can't build it fast enough, I think is the reality. At 6%, we're never going to make up this number. So I wanted to call that out. We did, I think, add data in there that for all the newly approved projects like Washington Founders Row and the West Falls Church, we think we're going to add between 80 to 100 new units, and those will have the new provision that we negotiated where they will never expire. So that's the good news, is the new stuff that we're going to build won't expire, but everything that we've built to date, the 244 units, most of them will expire, with the exception of Virginia Village and Winter Hill. Nancy, anything you want to jump in on that point? Did I get all that correct? Okay. Life cycle has kind of been updated a bit too. Staff has included data on recent graduates. So basically the conclusion is if you are a newly graduated high school or a college student, you can't afford to live in Falls Church. That's kind of the simple version of 2 pages of text there. And then moving on to the strategies and actions. There's a lot of really good ideas there. There's a mix of both practical and aspirational. And I think my editorial comment for this that I've been encouraging both the Housing Commission and staff to think about is we can't do all of this, and we certainly can't do all of this with no money. I really think we need to be thoughtful and rally behind a handful of priorities. We need to choose probably 3 things that we're going to be really serious about and do those well. Because at the current rate we're doing, we keep talking about a bunch of ideas, but we need to take some more serious action, especially when we look at those expiration dates. It doesn't align with the vision we talked about it being that kind of welcoming, all-inclusive community for all generations, because the reality is not only are we going to have a bunch of affordable housing that's going to expire, but we're not doing enough to kind of add to that stock. So I will leave you with that. But thank you again to staff for working with us on kind of getting a lot more data and getting a lot more information in there. I think it's come a long way. I think housing staff has a plan to kind of go deeper on this and talk about kind of an affordable housing action plan, which I think is probably where a lot of our interest is going to be, is how do we turn this into more tactical projects what should those three priorities are if we believe those are the right things to do.
All right, well, thank you. Thank you for
Mayor,
your,
as you turn it over to question comment, I just want to call your attention to the hard copy of the letter from the Housing Commission that Ms. Vincent handed out, as well as that you were emailed it this afternoon. Thank you, Mayor.
all right, thank you, and thank you, Councilwoman Hardy, for your work, and all the other folks who spent so much time on this very important section of the comp plan. Mr. Wadiska, do you guys want to start again with comments from the Planning Commission?
Yeah, well, let me just turn it over to the planning commission members, and does anybody have any comments?
I can start. I have a couple of comments. One thing real quick, and maybe it's just me, but I love the glossary. I find the definition of AMI to be the one I want to be most clear, and it is very confusing. We seem to be providing the definition of some policy that the city has related to AMI. So I would love a more clear explanation of AMI with maybe some actual numbers of examples, like what is the current AMI, what is the A of AMI composed of, what is our area, how do we, because I think that number and all of those percentages of it are so like integrated in everything that if you don't really understand that and have some sense for what those numbers are, I think you're lost on a lot of things because you don't have great context. So I would suggest beefing that up. I also think that I think the action plan with the aspirational things makes sense, but I also think that almost everything in here costs money, either directly or indirectly, and without some assessment of how much the different things would cost, I think it's hard to decide which three or whatever to really focus on. So I don't know what and how or when that kind of analysis is made. Even things like, there's a lot of talk about changing some zoning to allow granny flats and these other things that aren't well defined, but I think I understand what they are. Like, I think it's risky to look at zoning changes from the perspective of one issue, because zoning affects all kinds of other things. So if you have a bunch of granny flats, how does that affect parking, traffic, and environmental stuff? So I think it's obviously for the housing chapter, that's the way you look at it, but at some point all that has to be synthesized with, well, what other impacts would these zoning changes have, and potentially the other impacts are worse or cost more money or somehow have unintended consequences. So I thought that was a challenge, like when I was reading some of these ideas about zoning changes. And like one of them, a couple places it was sort of commented that, and I generally agree with this, that density can help because there's a lot of value that you can get from allowing density. But I think there was one comment in some of the meeting notes that I read that was like, if we had more density, that would increase supply, that could lower prices, and I think all that's true. But obviously, there's some tipping point. If I'm a developer and I can build something in the City of Falls Church and charge a certain rent, or I can build it somewhere else and charge a higher rent. So I don't think that is those kinds of solutions necessarily scale. So you can't just get super dense. And on the flip side of density, at some point, the city can't get any bigger, or we become sort of like a big city with skyscrapers and stuff like that. So I think there's also this fundamental question of, we look at these regional projections on population change, and it seems like we're trying to chase that and keep up with it. But I don't know that that's actually possible. So I think that's another question is, while we want to be inclusive and have space for everybody, we're not going to be able, we're constrained to geographically, so there's only just so much we can do. And then, so that's my final comment, will be that one of the challenges I think for us is, like, to me, the fundamental question of I don't think anyone in this day and age, I'm sure somebody disagrees with this, but I love the idea of being inclusive and having space for all kinds of people. But we compare ourselves to our neighbors. Our neighbors all have, I bet you could take 2.2 square mile chunks of Fairfax County or Arlington County and have way worse numbers than what we have in the City of Falls Church in terms of diversity of all these housing options. And so it's hard because we're trying to do a lot with only a little bit. So I think this chapter overall is great and very aspirational. I think I worry that it's too aspirational and not practical enough in some areas, and maybe gives us a false sense of what's possible, which is okay, except that when it comes down to making an action plan, I think we need to have some of the data to make sure we're not accidentally making things worse instead of better. I'm done. Thanks.
I think one of the things the housing chapter shows is that, especially in the last 10 years, we were able to bring some diversity of housing into the market that we didn't have before. You know, I was talking to someone who 15, 20 years ago wanted to buy a condo and had to leave the city for it because we just really didn't have condos and things like that. So I think we did that very well. But I think what's really scary to me, and I very much appreciate the updates that happen on page 10, where you get the expiration dates for the committed affordable rental homes and the ownership ADUs, and they added the change in affordable housing. To me, that was the page that was updated that was most influential when I looked at it. Because I think that, you know, we've gone through a long time of dealing with Falls Church Housing Corp in the past about trying to bring a new building on that didn't work out, and we just keep circling this affordable housing thing. And in the meantime, Lee Square is no longer affordable, Merrill House is no longer affordable. I mean, we have the Fields in a couple years that could possibly go as well. And so to me, if you ask me, the crisis in here is affordable housing. And I know there's like the zoning changes, the granny flats, they're really not going to help us that much, because I think a lot of them, the people who do are renting parts of their house, in some cases legally or illegally, they're charging way above affordable for those. So I don't think that's really, I think we really have to look at, is there a way to roll back? Is there a way to get Merrill House affordable again? Are we going to commit to the Fields in 2 years or 3 years when we're going to have to start working with the federal government to decide if the Fields stays affordable or not? So to me, that's the crisis here. And until we decide we want to dedicate some money towards it, we're basically just going to time out on the Fields. And I'm just really very afraid of that, because you look back in 2012, our numbers don't look so bad, but our population has gone up and our stock has gone way down. And I think that's a real shame. And, you know, and this is obviously why a lot of the people who work in the city can't live here. And we're very highly dependent on a lot of affordable housing, like in Seven Corners, and Fairfax County wants to get rid of that at some point. So, I mean, that could have a big impact on our city when we lose that kind of housing. And if you look at the neighborhoods in Fairfax County, that's the housing neighborhoods like between 29 and 50, you can see those infill going into those as well. So eventually, you know, we can't depend entirely on Fairfax County's affordable housing choices and near us.
All right, thank you. Who else has something to say?
I don't want to belabor the point. I mean, I think my colleagues on the commission have I think, made good points. I mean, I think the chapter does a good job about sounding the alarm that the city is facing. Maybe crisis isn't too strong of a word. I mean, it's a serious problem. I think affordable housing is one of those issues that it struggles often when competing against the milieu of city priorities or any municipal priorities, because sometimes it lacks a champion, and I'm not sure who is best suited. I think maybe a number of actors in the city, because it's a kind of issue that it almost needs a salesperson to show folks who maybe wouldn't benefit directly from affordable housing why it's important. It's not always as easy as other city priorities to sell. You don't usually have neighbors who don't need affordable housing, clamoring for it. And so sometimes it needs a champion to help people understand why it's important. And that also helps them with shifting funding priorities, because there's a limited pot of resources. And if affordable housing is going to be successful competing against those other priorities, it kind of needs that groundswell of support, and often it's lacking that. And I think that's probably part of the reason why. It's not always an intentional neglect of affordable housing, but it's lacking a champion. Other voices are screaming louder, and so the affordable housing is usually put further down on the list. And so that's my only observation. But I mean, I think the chapter does a good job at trying to sound that alarm. Some of the changes especially help to do that. But then the other side of that, the next step is explaining to the wider community why it's important. Because it's not always as obvious. People like us, I think, who are engaged in this issue and are familiar with it understand why from a policy perspective. But
not everyone sort of gets it. They don't always think about it that way. So that would be my only observation. I don't know if the chapter could address that, identify sort of champions, people who can help to advocate for it, but that might be helpful.
Other comments?
Yeah.
Mr. Stevens?
Yeah, there's a lot of work that was obvious when I read through this today. And when you go back and compare it to the 2005 chapter, there's differences really kind of jump out. So folks are doing a lot of work. Obviously, it's an issue, affordable housing. It requires multiple solutions across a lot of fronts, much like stormwater does. And so even though ADUs, accessory dwelling units, may not be something by itself that would solve the problem, I think it's something that probably could merit some additional attention. I think it was page 19 before the term even comes up in this document. And at a conference I attended a couple of weeks ago, a national conference on urban planning, it was a big issue across the whole country. So the whole issue of ADUs is getting a lot of attention. And even our neighbor Arlington is in the process of updating their code. So I think it's certainly plausible for us to start that dialogue here. It's not going to be solved overnight, but I think we should be becoming more aware of what's happening throughout the country, what results are happening, to see if it might benefit us. The other thing is I was happy to see there was a reference to the Greenway Downs overlay, which is something that the Planning Commission has been very interested in seeing. So I would encourage us to follow through with that.
All right, other comments from the Planning Commission?
Just quickly, I'd agree with that. I think this is a good start. I think it doesn't go far enough at all. I mean, especially reflecting the crisis that is out there. There is some survey data that's in here where folks, I think, do recognize that it is a critical issue for the city and that it is a crisis. We had a flood and a tragic one, or a significant one last week, and we see action from the council. I think if this issue merited that same kind of crisis, that we would see the same kind of action. And to Mr. Stevens' point, the trend around the country is much more aggressive than what's in here now. Again, I think this is a good start. I do think this is what is achievable right now. And I don't want us to pat ourselves in the back and say that this is going to solve the problem. I do think that it's going to help, but I don't think it's going to solve the problem by any stretch.
All right, anything else? Why don't we move to council then? Anyone at council have additional comments? Mr. Duncan?
Thank you. Thanks to the staff for all your hard work on this. It's really an issue that many of us care a lot about, and that's why we've poured so much effort into it. If anything has been said or done that, in any way made you think that, previous versions of this document were inadequate, it's just a reflection of the fact that, we have a lot of ambitions here and some frustration too that's built up over the years. And I was able to go to the Housing Commission meeting and offer my thoughts last week, so I'll not repeat them. Thank you for incorporating most of the things that I said into it. One thing that I don't see, that I want to ask, is we do seem to tiptoe around, or perhaps even not address, the question of whether this group of leaders who sit around this table here today are accepting of the notion that we attempt to do dedicated affordable housing construction. Either a building that is, wholly or substantially dedicated to affordable housing, or a much richer percentage than the 6%, which, as Ms. Hardy said, is good. I mean, it's okay, and the fact that they're permanent is something we can all be proud of, but it's just not going to get us there in any way, shape, or form if we lose the projects like the Fields and Merrill House and other places that are dropping off the affordability scale. So I would love to know. I mean, 10 years ago, these two bodies, sat together and developed a plan for a dedicated affordable housing building. And at the commission meeting, there was a really good discussion about, the philosophy of that. Some people are not supportive of that idea because they see it as a project, as a negative, as a stigma attached to living in affordable housing. however, told stories of buildings which are built, brand new, with, high quality construction, maybe not the finest frills that you'd see in $1 million condominium, but still, buildings that people would be proud to live in. And to me, we're not going to really make significant progress until we try to find some opportunities in the city for buildings of that sort that you see in Arlington and other jurisdictions. The reference here to partnering with number 9 on page 18, partnering with nonprofits and regional agencies, that's good. I would add faith groups to that if it's not somewhere else in the document. We made a run at that 10 years ago, and a lot of frustration spun off because it didn't happen. But I'd like to know from all of y'all, if somebody came to us with a proposal to use, property that they had for a building that was, 60% affordable, would you be interested? Yes or no? If the answer is no, then by all means, let's go pursue some of these other things. But if the answer is, well, yeah, I'd think about it, then at least personally, I don't know about being, you're right, we need a champion, and I'm not sure I'm the right person for that, but I think we do need to know if there's going to be support on Council and Planning Commission for that sort of approach, which would move the needle more significantly than the 6% approach that we have now.
All right, thank you. Mr. Snyder?
Thanks a lot. So I first got my start here as president of the Falls Church Housing Corporation. So I've lived this issue for more than 20 years. So I'm appreciative that we're continuing to look at it, and we've got some ambitious plans. One of the major ways in the past that people have been able to break the cycle of poverty is through home ownership. And in my view, the number one priority ought to be the provision of affordable owner-type houses, condos, if you will. We had a few for a while. We pretty much stopped that over the last 20 years. I think that's a real gap. We can talk about affordable, subsidized, if you will, rental housing, but we're really not helping people get out of the cycle of poverty. So if we're really interested in solving a fundamental issue and also dealing with the diversity in our neighborhood, I suggest that we focus on providing for the capability for people to own and to start to move up the ladder. And that has traditionally been the way by which much of the wealth in this country has been created, and it has been denied certain minorities in various ways in the past. So if we really want to do something that's significant and over the long term will improve the lives of a lot of folks, not just make us feel better that we dealt with a current issue, but really address that, then I would recommend that that's where we put a lot of our focus. The second point I want to make is that we talk here on page 16 about building a project for large families. There's an irony there because we just provided significant taxpayer subsidies to seniors in order to prevent them from selling their homes to that would be market rate to bring people in with more kids for the schools. We also cite Pearson Square as the most negative of all of our projects in terms of net cost to the city because it's large units, it's rental, and it generates huge numbers of public service costs. And yet now we're talking about doing exactly the same thing. So I think it's a little, I'm having trouble squaring that. Another point I want to make is that I supported moving to 8%. I think we should have done it. I think we should have done it with the project we just approved at 6%. Why it was at 6%, I don't know. But I think we should definitely bump up the requirements on new developments of all the ways to deal with it. That is probably the least painful way. The next issue I want to raise is we've got to avoid making housing affordable for some by making it more unaffordable for others. It's critical that the city remain at least competitive with smaller jurisdictions for purposes of our tax rate. So whatever we do, we've got to keep an eye out for that element of affordability as well. So these are just some of the thoughts I have. I would prioritize absolutely at the top the provision of small condominiums and condominiums capable of people beginning to build their wealth so that we can truly break the cycle of poverty, not simply reinforce it. These other factors, it seems to me, all need to be considered as well as when we move forward. So those are a few thoughts that I had. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Mr. Lichtenhouse?
Did you turn it on for me? It was nice, Tim. So on page 16, when we talk about incentives for builders, can anybody speak to the types of incentives that we're referring to there or we're alluding to? Incentives to home builders to provide a range of housing?
I'm trying to find where you're talking about.
Sorry, it's second full paragraph, left side, page 16 of the. It's got some red in there. Yeah.
Incentivize or require?
So the kinds of incentives that we can give to home builders would be, for one thing, is a reduction of permitting fees, a streamlined process. The fees can be substantial for an individual home. Time is money. Also, so that's really the biggest one that we could be providing to home builders.
Okay. Just from a development incentive perspective, so Councilman Snyder had talked about going from 6 to 8%. I do agree that is probably the quickest, most tangible way to address it. When you look at the affordability trend, it's only going to be exacerbated by Amazon. It's only going to be exacerbated by the influx of people into this area, whether they want to work at the new Inova facility, they want to work at Amazon, or for whatever reason. So it's only going to continue to be exacerbated. And I, for one, don't think that we can percent ADU our way out of it if it's something that we truly want to address here in the city. I do think that you have to look beyond just the cost that we would bear ourselves, because the truth of the matter is, when it comes to affordability or affordable housing, many of the things that are addressed here are going to come at a cost. And it's a cost that the city leadership and the citizens themselves have to be willing to bear. And one of the trade-offs in terms of looking at other opportunities would be through those incentives to have developers consider developing affordable here, because it just doesn't compete from a market rate perspective. They just wouldn't be interested in doing it without the incentives. That's just the fact of the matter. No well-meaning developer in the world is going to do it out of the goodness of their heart when they have the option to build market rate. One of the more successful programs that took place in downtown Washington, D.C., which has effectively become a moot point just in the economics of how it's calculated. There was a pilot program for affordable housing in downtown D.C., and there were a number of apartment buildings constructed. And it was based on a calculation of the income that was generated. I have some experience from a research perspective on this. And it was very effective back in the 60s and 70s and 80s. To incentivize developers to build what is now affordable housing. But that incentive is no longer in place simply because of the way that it's calculated. It just doesn't make any sense. You'd rather pay the normal property taxes as opposed to take advantage of the pilot. So some of the development burned off there in terms of it being an incentive. I think things like pilot programs and some of those other programs we've seen in surrounding jurisdictions, that when you talk about incentives for developers from a commercial perspective, are probably the ones that may be more effective. I absolutely agree with Andy's perspective that we are 2.2 square miles. We have to be honest with ourselves about what we can effectively accomplish, and without having the data in front of us, it's difficult to make those decisions to really understand. But I do disagree that I think those granny flats, I think that could be effective. Parking could be an issue, but when you think about kids coming back from college, when you think about aging in place, putting somebody in a shed in the backyard.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying it would. I'm saying
I understand.
You got to look at the whole.
Sure, I get it. Yeah, but I do think that some of the things that you guys have outlined in here, whether it's the quads or it's the granny flats, those are things I think that it can be effective if they are researched appropriately and you have the data, because I can't imagine that if those turned into rentals, yeah, that could create parking issues on streets. I also, Mr. Snyder took one of my favorite topics, which when we talk about diversified housing stock, we need more condos, flat out. Would make a big difference. And when you combine that with the first home buyer tax credit, which you guys have outlined in there, and I was really pleased to see that, that does provide an option. And not everybody needs to live in a 1,000 square foot condo with their first job. Her first condo was like 400 square feet. It did the job, got it done. And I think that we should be embracing projects like that, because that is an area of the housing stock that we just have not seen here. And that was part of that was because of the downturn in the market. But I think it's something that if we can figure out a way to, I won't say incentivize, but attract that type of development, that'll help solve some of the problem as well. But I do commend everybody on the work here. This is a very, very complicated issue and something that is only going to become more complicated and more dire. And I think that this is good progress.
All right, thank you very much. Are there other, Ms. Hardy?
So I realize I spoke a lot already, but I wanted to chime in on a couple points. So I think obviously the data really spoke volumes. The other thing I wanted to point out is on page 7, the housing stock by type. So it shows kind of the single family homes that we have, the middle housing, the townhouses, duplex, quads, which pretty much don't have any other than the same 600 or so we had back in 20 years ago. And then the multifamily, which we clearly deliberately added a whole bunch of. So when we talk about kind of what is the right mix, one of the questions I had to staff is there an ideal kind of aspirational target we should shoot for, right? Because clearly we haven't added that middle one, and which means, your teachers, your, new families starting out can't afford to live here because not only has it gotten really expensive, we just haven't added stock. So I think that's a question, a policy question we need to decide is, besides affordable housing, are we going to do anything about that missing middle? That's a very common term that you hear throughout the region now because we've essentially priced out that entire population. We kind of have this bar strategy in Falls Church where you can either rent, a 2-bedroom apartment for $2,000, or you have to buy a $1 million and up house stock in the middle. And what does that mean for our demographics? So that's the other kind of data point I wanted to point out. On the 6%, 8%, whatever inclusionary zoning percent we want, clearly I think 6 to 8 to 20 even could be really helpful. But I agree with the comments earlier that it really doesn't solve it. We build a project every 3 to 4 years, and even at 20%, that doesn't help the erosion of affordable housing we have. So I think we need to have a more serious discussion of, are we willing to commit to kind of a standalone project to really help the quantity and really get the stock back up there. And I'll go back to my earlier point is all of these ideas really need money, and it needs a sustainable, dedicated funding source. So we can argue every year about whether we want to carve money out of our operating budget, but that means we're going to be pitting, teacher salaries and paving projects and traffic calming against housing, and that's a very unpopular topic, and no one wants to do that. But I think we should more seriously talk about whether we want to look at a meals tax increase. Alexandria did that a year ago, so we probably should have data from Alexandria on what has that impacted in terms of their sales tax and people going out to eat in Alexandria. We can certainly look at property tax. We can look at the TOT, hotel taxes. There's a bunch of other sources. We probably need to do better analysis, but my argument is that we need a sustainable source. We can't just kind of pick where we're going to invest each year, because I think housing is one of those things that has gotten neglected the past few years. I think we need a more serious action plan on preserving the fields. While everything else is going to expire, that is a third of our housing stock, and we can't afford to lose that in one fell swoop. And I think that probably could open the door to that kind of, could we do a standalone project there? Could we add density to, it's nearly a 5-acre site. At that, besides the 96 units, could we add, say, 100 units of mixed income housing there? That would help solve the missing middle problem that we just talked about, and solve the fields at the same time, which would give developers an incentive to make it profitable for them. So that's an idea there. And the third bucket, I think, which includes granting flats, is really rehauling the zoning. So how do we incent renovations versus tear downs? Because the more we can preserve the $700,000 Ramblers, which is kind of sad that that's considered affordable in Falls Church, instead of preventing it from turning into the $1.5 million house, that's additional single-family housing stock that's important to preserve. And clearly environmental benefits, stormwater benefits, all the things we just talked about. How do we add density, whether it's looking at quads, looking at townhouses, looking at granny flats, so we add additional options. Clearly a lot of downstream impacts like parking and changes to residential neighborhoods, but I think zoning, offers a lot of opportunity to think about how to actually add density and additional housing. Because I think the data is pretty clear is not only do we have a crisis in terms of affordable housing, I think we also have a crisis in terms of housing supply. The whole region just needs to add a lot more housing. And if you come from an economic, like I do, I think you generally believe that if you add more housing supply, prices usually should come down. And so I'm kind of a believer that that's got to help some too.
So this dedicated standalone project that folks keep referring to, for my own edification, can you get clarification around that? Is that a city-owned affordable housing project? Is it something where you partner up with somebody like a Wesley? What do we, when we're talking about standalone city-funded affordable housing project, what are we referring to?
So most of the discussion that I'm hearing and that I would support would be partnering with a nonprofit housing developer to build, say, an 80, 85 unit project that would be completely affordable. So there wouldn't be mixed income. So it would be affordable to folks at 40, 60, 80% of the area median income.
Okay. And it would be operated and managed by that nonprofit?
By the nonprofit or a service provider.
Yeah, so we attempted that in the past with Falls Church Housing Corp. To turn one of the office buildings that are between Maple and South Washington, it would taking it down and put an affordable building there. But the financing didn't work out for that. In the on the area plan for the city center, we had suggested in that city center area plan that the city might want to concentrate getting more of the units in Virginia Village. We already own 4. This is a very large piece of property. So if you go and look at that area plan, Mr. Snyder, this is one of his concepts too, is that we should probably try to take Virginia Village, which is a big piece of land with a small number of units on it, and we could, triple, quadruple the number of units on that piece of property by doing a building there, if we could find a partner. But I mean, right now we only own 4 of the units, and there's quite a few others. But anyway, so those are some of the things that we've talked about in the past. And so I think Mr. Duncan's correct that would be a very smart thing for us, because we can't be assured that any of the commercial properties, like Lee Square is dropped off now. Roosevelt, which is over near my end of town, used to be fairly affordable as a condo building, and it's no longer Madison's apartment building. I don't think it's affordable. All of those used to be affordable 15 or 20 years ago. When I came out of college, I actually rented an apartment at Lee Square Apartments. And there's no way in an entry-level job I could do that now. So it's changed a lot.
Mr. Snyder? Go ahead.
One last comment. So in this plan, we talk about the fields with the credit expiring 2026. I think that's actually end of 2027. I want to confirm that. And speaking with Wesley and the developers over there, I believe we've actually got another year.
Verified, thank you.
Mr. Snyder, do you have something you want to say?
I would agree with Councilwoman Hardy that there are zoning things that can be done. For example, I think we identified some time back that many of the older houses that were built have been made non-conforming because of expanded setback requirements when the R1B zoning category was amended to have bigger front yards. And so it's very difficult, for example, for those to be renovated. Same with the Greenway Downs area. There could be, if you could forgive those nonconformities, you might be able to allow people to add on to those, or perhaps do a second unit that would take up no more space than a large teardown would require. So I think there are gaps in the zoning ordinance that we don't have a very big playbook in terms of being able to do more than single family or large apartment projects. And there certainly are examples elsewhere of faith-based groups who've turned parking lots into new housing, go across the boundary in Arlington. That's been done. So we definitely have some ability to affect these. The Virginia Village concept was if we could collect those units, vacate our more than 1 acre of streets that we publicly own, and create an area for an attractive, as Mr. Duncan suggested, well-built but affordable building that could give you more units, but better units, and still have room for open space. That would take action and money, though. But we could harvest some of the value we have in streets, possibly. But you're going to need some money to make these things happen. So these are some of the concepts that have been talked about. Even the Fields project, is there extra street right-of-way that doesn't need to be there that could become a building in between units that already exist? So I think there's some innovative things that could be explored. There's no guarantee that would work, but I think we should look at them.
Thank you, Jim. Can I ask you a question about the condominium point that was made? We do need more condominiums. Fortunately, up at the Gateway project, there's going to be some condominium. That's good. But, it's not like the market has not come to us, and at least in my time on council, with proposals to build condominiums. Generally, the market seems to want to build, 60 to 70 units at Spring Street. There was a proposal. Park and Lee, there was a proposal. North Washington, Columbia. All three of those, for a variety of reasons, never really got off the ground. One of the reasons was, naturally, like any building that's proximate to single-family homes, there's certain reluctance to the density that is involved even in a 60 or 70 unit building. Is there anything that we can do to continue to encourage those sorts of condominium proposals to come our way? Is there something that we're not doing or that we could do that would bring more of those to us? So maybe we would find one that we could accept. Affordable housing is important, but affordability is also important, and the missing middle is there some way that I can have a hand in building a condominium that would sell for $475,000 that would be accessible to somebody, a couple perhaps, starting out in the world?
Well, we've had several people who've tried, and we've brought a number of qualified developers in who've looked at this. They spent a lot of time working on it. They went away unable to do it for various reasons. Either it took too long, process got too involved, the extra expense. You might be able, I think Mr. Snyder's point about could you build some smaller units, I think you'd need to create an ability where some of these things can be done more as a matter of right, where, for example, in your transition zones, you might allow some commercial uses on the ground floor and maybe 3 levels of loft-type small units that could be purchased. The process of entitlement here is very expensive and time-consuming. Time is killing deals. And then the cost of structured parking. I had a conversation today with a developer who was looking at sites, and the cost of structured parking is very high. And they really need to get very expensive dollars per square foot to construct these things. So I think it's worthy of more research. I think also additional types of housing, for example, stacked townhouses where you might have 2s over 2s, you can handle the parking in the building. That's a very viable market product that's being done all over the area, but not here because we don't enable it. And so, there's we don't have many tools in our toolbox in terms of zoning. We just don't. We haven't created the mechanisms for some of these things to happen.
Because the special exception process requires, one of the requirements is for a commercial use, and sometimes projects that are back off the main street, they don't really lend themselves to a ground floor commercial use of anything other than maybe professional offices. But yet that's the only tool that we have to redevelop some of these places.
And I think professional offices are a good use because we aren't going to get a lot of office buildings built here, unfortunately, because they're tending to go to big areas like Tyson's or downtown or at a metro. Smaller offices that people can own or rent for a smaller business or a smaller professional office is a good thing to have in the city, and new space there's not a lot of it. But I think being able to, it's almost a form-based approach where maybe instead of getting a single-family house on a transitional lot, you might get a level of commercial with 3 levels of small condominium loft-type units.
Jim, don't you think, do you think that the requirement that we have from a zoning perspective that you've got to replace the amount of what's considered commercial on site with the same or more restrictive for condo development? We ran into that issue with Park and Lee, and I'm, for one, I think a professional office doesn't necessarily constitute true commercial. And if you're looking at incentivizing developers for condos, to have them try to replace the same square footage of what really was a house that was turned into a dentist's office doesn't really
I think we need more of a qualitative analysis of what's that commercial producing in terms of real value? What's it valued? What kind of taxes does it pay? Versus the projection of what new space would do. I do think having some professional office space that's within walking distance of people's homes, that people can own and control, they're not at the mercy of a landlord, or they don't have to go to a big office building somewhere at
So
Tyson.
what I was referring to, so take the Park and Leaf for example. There were a couple buildings there that were considered commercial, and there was conversation about, sorry? Zone commercial, but it was
transitional presently.
right. But as part of the approval, there was this requirement that there needed to be the same amount of commercial space, what was considered commercial.
I think it's like substantially more.
Substantially more. My question is that overly restrictive to where you're effectively losing money? And frankly, I don't think every residential site, if there is some commercial that existed, and I would argue that that is not really the type of commercial that would need to be replaced, that isn't required. We don't need retail on every residential multifamily project or condo project. It just seems to be overly restrictive.
I think the difficulties retail is having now, just in this new era of economic development where every retail is struggling, on good main streets. I mean, look at Route 7 and Bailey's Crossroads. So there are going to be fewer retail places. They have to be really well located, but service uses that provide real service to people, whether it's your accountant or your dentist or a therapist. I mean, spaces that are within the community that you don't have to drive to, I think you have a lot of value. So having places where you have prime retail, secondary, and service uses, there's geography that makes sense for that. I think we need to look at qualitatively how much revenue and economic impact is something having versus just a square foot to square foot comparison.
So not going to.
It needs to be a smarter, in my view, a smarter calculus as to the value of what's there versus what's being proposed.
So
what the projections.
So last question related to the condo. So for that particular requirement where it's got to be substantially more, right? At least the same or slightly more. I can't remember what the actual language is. From a condo perspective or other types of what I would consider potentially more affordable diversified housing stock, making it from staff to council for consideration, that particular requirement in and of itself, are there projects that we're just not seeing because it doesn't meet that threshold and it's never making it in front of council to be able to even look at those projects? Or are we having some where you've got this kind of overly prescriptive requirement that is preventing those projects from getting to us for consideration?
Well, I think we'd have to go back and talk to people, but there were a number of very qualified people who came here, talked to people from outside the area, wanted to do things here, and they went away and went elsewhere and built things. So, I mean, that's not a good track record. So we need to find, if we really want some small condominium developments as a transition to larger developments on the main corridors, and I do think from a land use and scale point of view, that's a very positive thing. We should explicitly encourage that. I do think some of these other ideas like stacked townhouse units as a product that is more affordable and that is more saleable, not as hard to do. It's in the marketplace. I think we should explore those as if you want that kind of development.
So my request would be, because some of these requirements that we have are more blunt instruments, that if there are developers that feel passionate that they've got some type of creative use, whether it is smaller condos, it's something more affordable, something we haven't even thought of, that we have the opportunity to at least evaluate that so we don't have a blunt instrument at a city level that prevents us from even having the opportunity to have that discussion.
Right.
I would rather look at more and say, no, we don't like it, as opposed to us not even having an opportunity to see it, because we are not always going to have a corner of monopoly on good ideas in terms of how we diversify our housing stock. And I would certainly like to spend more time talking about that late into the evening, early morning hours, to be able to come up with the right solutions that the market brings to bear. The mayor doesn't seem excited about that comment.
I will say that I was at a...
I like you guys. I want to spend more time with you.
I won't say any more after this, but I was at a Council of Governments Planning Directors meeting last Friday, and there was discussion about the affordable housing, the housing crisis in the region. There's an article that's in the Business Journal. Chuck Bean, who's the director there, really a really good analysis with a lot of information about the situation. But the COG retreat, this is going to be a big topic of what's the regional approach to solving this problem. And you're looking at a need for 365,000 additional units, and they would like to aspirationally have at least a third of them in the moderate and affordable, and then in the, market rate, and then the high end. This is a hard thing for the region, and we're part of that region. So I don't know who's going to that retreat, but it's going to be the main topic.
So my last request would be yes. So if
Wait, your last? I thought you already had one.
I have one more. I just thought about
Use
this.
Your last request.
This is last
Two
request.
requests to go. Yeah.
Come on, man.
Letty's going to get the wrong idea here.
I know. I'm taking her spot here. So making sure that we get to see more creative uses that come out of staff in front of council, but also to Letty's point, and I've hammered this point home previously, we cannot forget about the workforce housing. We spend a lot of time talking about the low income. I want to make sure that we create housing opportunities for folks that work in the city, so people are having to drive 2 hours every day to work here, work at the schools. That has to be front and center, that it has to be equal opportunity for everyone, not just a particular segment or a particular demographic.
All right. Do we have other comments? That's right.
Can I just?
Yes,
I
of
just want to
course.
do one quick thought because this goes to my main point. I like these are all great ideas, but even the idea of taking like a $700,000 Rambler and letting them do a addition that currently isn't supported because of zoning. If the result of that is now you have a family with 4 kids living in a now $900,000 Rambler instead of a $1.3 million brand new house, I think that's great, but we have to acknowledge the tax differential there, right? That costs the city money because those kids are going to go to school. It's going to cost money. We're getting less tax than we would. And I'm all in favor of that, but doing that without realizing, wow, if we do that a lot, there's going to be pressure on the tax rate, which Mr. Snyder pointed out he doesn't want to do, or a pressure on the cost of the schools and stuff like that. So that's where I think we have to think through all of these different ideas and what the actual costs are, because we look at Pearson Square and the 3 bedrooms and how expensive that is for the city, and we could build more of those, but the tax rate will go up. And maybe I'm personally fine with that, but I don't see how we create more affordable housing in the city without other people in the city paying for that, which I think is okay, but we just probably should be straightforward about it. There's no silver bullet unless we start drilling for oil or something and find some untapped natural resource.
The reality is none of this is going to be free, right? And we have to go back and look at ourselves in the mirror and say, how important is that vision, right, on our values? We say we want to be welcoming and inclusive. That costs money to make happen.
To Andy's point, though, for example, Andy, could you take one of those older homes, gut it and renovate it, but keep it small, and put a cottage in the back and have multi-generational users, where I've got someone who's got a barrier-free cottage home that they can live in, and a young family can live in smaller space up front and not tear it all down. You'd probably have less impact on the environment building it that way too. I mean, it'd be interesting to see if it could be done.
Corey.
Yes, hesitant to say anything since I'm the newbie, but I'm hearing a lot of different solutions that we're considering. And my impression when reading this chapter is analytically, when I got to the projections of what are the types of housing that, or the housing that will be demanded by AMI, I found myself wanting a little bit more of a granular view of the types of housing that would meet the needs of the various AMI units. Because what I'm having a hard time seeing, I mean, it's clear that we're going to fall off a cliff with affordable, but what I'd like to see is a little bit more of what is the demanded type of housing, what is the gap between the demand and the supply we currently have, and then map out by housing type the playbook that I think is probably in your head, but it would be helpful for me at least to understand, for this type of housing, here are the levers that we, Falls Church, can pull to make a difference, and here's the effect it would have, both in terms of numbers of units it would generate, as well as the cost effectiveness of it. And so if we could, and I don't see that listed as identified as a task in the strategy, so I don't know if that's a strategy that we'll be doing or a revision that's possible in the deck, but having that sort of clearer mapping of gaps, solutions to close the gaps, and impact of those solutions would be helpful for me, please.
All right. Okay. Yes, Ms. Vincent.
I just want to kind of piggyback onto this cost discussion. So when we look at costs, we have to look also beyond the numbers, the cost of schools, that kind of thing. We have to look at, right now, do we want to have a Falls Church that is one community? What's good for one part of the community is good for the whole community. And how do you measure that? We can look at the example of Fairfax, where they have the one Fairfax instead of having the two Fairfaxes. That's the same thing that's happening here in Falls Church, where we have this very wealthy kind of community, but not everybody is that case. We do have people living in poverty in the city of Falls Church. So that dichotomy is growing and growing. And so, how is it that we address that? What do we do to make the community better for all of us, for everybody who's living here? And how do you measure those costs? There's different, it's not all going to be numbers.
And to be clear, I personally am more than happy to pay more to make the city more available to everyone. So I'm not making a case for not paying the cost. I'm just saying that there is a cost, right? So like when we look at projects that come through, a bunch of the analysis we do is the cost and the net benefit. And that's where I worry that if I think it's important that as we sell these ideas, we sell that it will have a cost and this is how we're going to pay for it. Because otherwise we get to the end of almost building an affordable structure 10 years ago, where that was, and then it falls apart at the end because there's not quite enough money and people weren't willing to spend more money. So that's where I fully support and encourage us to make the investment. But I think if we're not clear about it as we go, it will ultimately fail, because you'll get near the end and people will say, wait, this is going to cost a lot of money. Well, now I'm not as interested in it. So I think if we tackle that early on and as we go, I think we can get there. But by not doing that until the end, problems.
All right. Well, we've got a lot of passionate discussion, clearly, and a lot of great ideas, and I think there's plenty more work to be done. But I thank you all for this good discussion. It's a good start. There's plenty more work to be had. So thank you all. And why don't we move on to our next topic, which is our CIP budget. Yes.
Question in terms of timing. So clearly there was a lot of passion and desire to kind of move on this. So I know that we're scheduled to approve the comp plan in August. I want to make sure we build on the momentum and just don't kind of leave all the ideas hanging, because I feel like in the 3 years I've been in council, we've done this a lot and then we haven't done anything about it. So I think the next step is take the comp plan and translate it into like an action plan, like the analysis on, well, which one of these projects are going to have the biggest impact? What areas are we actually going to go focus on? Can I look to staff to kind of tell us, it doesn't have to be tonight, but when we're going to get to that? And is it reasonable to do it before the next budget cycle starts so we can actually have an informed discussion for FY21?
It's actually very reasonable. And in fact, the Housing and Human Services Office applied for a state grant to hire a consultant to develop this action plan, including some of the zoning revisions. So hopefully we'll be hearing soon about that.
Great.
All right. Thank you all for coming. We greatly appreciate your input and your ideas, hard work, and the staff as well. All right, Ms. Mester, what say you on the CIP update?
All right, well, what I'd like to do is give you a quick overview. Hey, Jim, have a good planning commission meeting. Give you a quarterly update on the CIP now that we're outside the budget process, because when we did it the last time, it was in the midst of the entire budget process. We've updated 32 projects. It's not the entire CIP, but it's some of the key, most active ones. I'm not going to go through all the projects. I'm going to highlight a few and then be glad to answer any questions. We do have 32 projects in here. We've kept to the same color coding for the sort of the traffic signal of go, caution, or stop. We have 10 that are green, and exciting this time, we have also 5 that are completed, so that's our blues. So we're excited to celebrate some of those. We have added some additional information to this process so that you have some more grounded information prior to going into the budget process, so that we can keep you more updated on where we've gotten grants, haven't gotten grants, where we have the money, but because of the way it's been allocated either regionally or by VDOT, it's in out years. And so some of the reds are flagged reds, but for example, on the third page, looking at the last 4 of those are reds. That's because the money is in FY21 or 20 or 23 and 24. So it's kind of giving you the outlook where we have a project in a need, but by grant awarding cycle, we don't have the money in the near term, or we don't have a project manager assigned. And the goal would be to finish up projects, so when they're finished up, we could assign them. So it's just to keep it a little bit more fluid and current information for you all. Some of the projects that I could highlight with the chart starting on line 79. First, I do want to highlight that the link here for the interactive map is still current, and it's updated to match this. So it's a good way for citizens in the community to go there, get a project summary, link back to who the project manager is if they have more questions. Downtown Plaza, of course, is one that we've celebrated the ribbon cutting for, and activities are happening. And today the downtown coordinator and business coordinator started. So your part-time temporary employees started today. So I had a good kickoff for orientation for their new role. Open space is close to closing for the Fellows property. The judge's order has all been filed and is waiting the judge's signature, so it's still showing yellow on this snapshot, but we hope to convert it to blue shortly. Stormwater, there's one project on this snapshot, but as we talked earlier, there was plenty that we've done and some that are still active or in design. I do want to highlight the Fire Station 6 because this has been a long-term delayed project that's been in the CIP to redo the HVAC system at the fire station because it was put in basically at a residential grade and it couldn't handle the 24/7 type public safety environment. Phase 1 is done, which is the upper level, and that is what impacted our volunteers the most, and that we were able to get it done 3 weeks early and in smooth partnership with Arlington. With this fiscal year starting and the new batch of approved council funding, phase 2 will start for the HVAC, which will be the main level. Oak Street Bridge, of course, we previously talked about. South Washington Transit is progressing. Is showing as yellow here. The undergrounding is done as we reported in March, but VDOT is still reviewing the construction bid documents so we can get that issued. We'll be meeting with them the end of this month. We are progressing nicely with the Broad Street ped crossings for design, and the budget is on track. And of course, we have added to this tracking the West Falls Church Joint Campus Project. That's the MBTA 70% money. They actually started the undergrounding today. And we are working with MBTA to plan a ribbon cutting. We just had the preliminary meeting with MBTA, trying to target that for the end of August before school is back in session. So as we get a date narrowed down with MBTA, we will reach out to council to make sure you all and our MBTA member on that board from council can attend. So we're excited that we're planning for that. And with that, Mayor, I'm glad to answer questions or follow up with any information council might desire.
All right. Who has questions or comments? Ms. Hardy.
So I have several tactical questions and then just an overall observation and question. So I'll just start at the top. Bike share, so now that it's launched, are we doing any sort of monitoring to know how it's going, usage? And if so, can we just get a quick report on that next time?
We can get a report. We do get data. And right now, the vendor is providing it to Carrie, who will be our lead staff to track it. We're working to download the software system so she can directly monitor usage and pull some reports together for us.
Okay. Clearly, there's a whole bunch of work around updated traffic lights and ped improvements, which are great. The one that I always get asked about is Hillwood and Annandale, which I know has had issues, and I think now we might have a new temp solution. Is that correct? That's going to go in soon?
We do have a new temp solution. The work started today. And then 6 months from now, we'll have the new permanent pole in place. And as of end of last week, we also resolved the insurance claim and are anticipating a check shortly to help cover the cost for that.
Since the vice mayor's not here, I'm going to ask her question, which is she's raised the Broad and Lee Street intersection as one that needs all 4 legs of the PED signal to be done, because we currently only have one done on the Kensington side. Is that on the plan to do when you mentioned Broad Street?
Yes, that's the Broad Street Hawk, and I just walked that street with our project manager and the engineering team to look at the best way to do that, so they're working on finalizing the designs.
So there will be PED signals on all 4 legs that Broad and... Great.
And crosswalks, it won't be realigned, so it's still going to have this
still
creative
a funky
little...
street, but at least people can cross more safely.
Yeah, all 4 or the 3 additional ones.
And on the missing sidewalk link, so again, I think everyone's been really thrilled about the park in North Virginia sidewalk connection. I think we still hear about it all the time, so I think it's been a long-vested community desire to have that. I think it's important, especially with the library, Cherry Park, and all those other things, the center there. So this is if you give a mouse a cookie, he's going to ask for a glass of milk. The analogy I use here. We really need a crosswalk there. The intersection just doesn't make sense right now. We only have crosswalks on the Cherry Hill side and then crossing Virginia in front of the pediatrician's office, and not one that kind of goes to the new sidewalk. And I hear the concern is that we can't add a crosswalk because there's no ADA ramp. And so I don't know if that was an intentional design or miss on the design by not having an ADA ramp to allow for a crosswalk for all 3 legs of that intersection.
Let me follow back up with Mike and the project manager, because I know at least one crosswalk was still pending, hadn't been put in.
Yeah, the only crosswalk I think is planned is across the north part of North Virginia, not across Park Avenue. And I think when we think about pedestrian connectivity, it's great that we're allowing everyone on the north side of Park Avenue to continue all the way east, but there's no way for them to cross until they get to the other side. So anyway, that would be great to do. And then similarly, I think everyone knows I'm a big fan of on-street parking. And while we've added that new sidewalk, we actually haven't added parking spaces where that new sidewalk is. And so I don't know if that was also considered or something that we can do, because I think with the shortage of parking at the library and often the pediatrician's office actually being the big driver, that I actually think they're the bigger driver than the library, whether we can actually consider more on-street parking along Park Avenue in that stretch. Also has traffic calming benefits.
I will check. I know it was reviewed and it has new signage up. I think there was some sight distance stuff and the one ADA ramp, but let me verify the details behind that analysis.
And so I think because we've done one project, now people are excited. They would love other projects. And so I think there's a general kind of missing sidewalk links kind of initiative. Where are we with kind of categorizing the missing links across the city and then some sort of prioritization so we can try to add more sidewalks?
We have a good database from the original pedestrian plan that we did. It had an ADA component that identified all 700 segments and link issues. Some things have been done with the grinding and other small projects, so we're having to update that now to see what's been done and then reprioritize. That is something that some of our grant money can do depending on the location for the RSTP or the 30%, so we also need to prioritize where we have funding to do. So the next deep dive will be part of the CIP process that we're developing next go round.
I mean, I think more and more people are going to want sidewalks, which is a good thing from a walkability, connectivity. I think I would encourage us to think about kind of a competitive bottoms-up process similar to neighborhood traffic calming, where neighborhoods can compete for kind of a pool of money we had set aside in the budget. Because clearly, if you're putting sidewalks in, sometimes people's gardens get impacted or the favorite tree might have to come down. And so I want to make sure that the neighbors work all that out first, that we have a majority of the neighborhood before the city comes in with money. So I think the NTC model might work for sidewalks as well, so that we can kind of get out of that. We don't have to prescribe a top-down solution, but set aside kind of budget money for that. And then on NTC, I know that this is the year that's the start of when we were getting a big grant to do NTC. How is that going? Because we haven't talked much about traffic calming projects recently. Is that money up and running now? Are we
Yeah, so the money for this year is up and running, and Jeff and our procurement are working through the federal money, because that 638,000 is the first tranche of federal funds. So it's in the procurement grant administrative process. The 800,000 that would have been the grant for FY21, or 22, so it was the out year. That was not funded. We were not successful, and so we'll recycle and go back at it again this next available go round. But
So
I
are
can
we
get a more
progressing through the-
specific update for the FY20 from
So
Jeff.
with what we have, are we getting through more projects with either hard or soft solutions?
Let me get the specifics, because it was going to do the light solutions to the heavy solutions, and then if there was some additional ones that we could pick up.
That queue does just get longer, and so I know the,
Yeah.
the
So I'll
relief
get-
valve was supposed to be this year when we got the big grant, and so I want to make sure we're making progress on that.
They are working on the grant administrative part of it, but I'll get some more specifics.
Great. And then my overall comment, kind of the more 10,000 view, when I read through this, I read comments in several projects that we were either over budget or not enough resources. Is that a general theme that council should be concerned about? And then if so, what are we going to do about it?
Yes, but we have some plans in place. So for this CIP that you just adopted, we put in a line item for pre-development, pre-engineering scoping. So we have $100,000 that can allow us, before we apply for grants next time, to properly scope it and get some preliminary numbers, because I think a lot of the grants you're seeing are ones that were very old, and so they were sort of back of the envelope, so we didn't get a full deep dive on scoping. We're also getting construction costs and other trending. So I think we're trying to be proactive, but we are seeing that as a trend and issue. So VDOT and our funders have actually been recommending a much higher contingency and escalating cost in all our grant applications. So we're actually in the revenue sharing ones we just put into VDOT. They have like 40% escalations in them just to account for that. And then we can, for the existing, before we're going for those grants, we'll start also using the dollars that council appropriated to do a deeper dive on the preliminary engineering, so we have better cost estimates.
So clearly, like, the cost is one side of it, but I guess the thing I would put the onus back on us is, do we have too many things in the CIP? Like, clearly I want to do all these things, but
yes.
I'd rather we get, 10 things done really well instead of trying to shoot for 50 and then come over under budget, and not be, on time and on budget for any of them, right?
So we have been looking very hard at this last CIP and future ones, so there weren't a lot of new projects in the current CIP before you for that exact reason. We need to get the ones we have done, and we have a limited staff, so we have to prioritize how to do them. The out year ones are to let you know there's out year ones, but we don't have PMs assigned to them because we don't actually have staff capacity. And so that was also a way to let you all know that we're monitoring the staff allocation and resources going forward. The Lincoln and West which is on page 5 of 6 in the middle of the page, that funding is going to actually be, has VDOT's initiated. We don't have any choice to deallocate that. And that's because that was one that went for a grant before we were ready to do it. Then the Founders Road came in and we weren't quite sure how that intersection and stuff was going to work, so we held on doing it. And so it will be deallocated. We can go back and apply for it, but as a priority goes with everything else, we also couldn't have physically done it. So this is where some of the catch-up we're working to allocate better out.
Thank you.
So while you're on that one, just describe for me, the idea I thought had been that when Founders Row opened, there would be traffic impacts in the residential streets nearby, Lincoln and West. And this project was supposed to be part of our dealing with that. So what are we not going to do now that we're probably not going to do that?
We won't rebuild that intersection and do the traffic signals and all right immediately, because it had already been delayed and not staffed. We are still doing the whole Founders Road, the WNOD, everything that you all are aware of. We are still doing the smaller version of the Safe Routes to School, where we were going to improve the intersection at Oak Street and crossing for bus stops and schools. So we're still doing that. And we're still doing the Great Falls and West intersection. That's the partnership with Fairfax County.
Okay, all right.
And it still will be in the long-range plan.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm rolling. Explain to me the Park Avenue Great Streets situation in as simple a terms as you can. The question I'm going to want to be focused on when we get to the library is what about the replacement of that utility pole that does not want to be in the middle of the new library entrance? Does the Park Avenue Great Streets have any relevance to that?
The Park Avenue Great Street project would, if fully funded, take care of the 2 poles, because there's actually 2 poles, one right at the corner and then one up by the driveway that goes, near the driveway that goes to the book drop. So we actually have to take care of 2 poles for the library. Right now we are probably $2 million short on funding for that project, and VDOT stepped up and using their own money to do pre-scoping and cost estimating for us, because this was one where we didn't have pre-scoping money. And we are meeting on July 29th to get VDOT's report on that. Then we'll look at the next round of NVTA funding and Smart Scale to see if we can supplement that funding for that project. NVTA's will be some advocacy because they don't necessarily see Park Avenue as a congestion mitigation solution for the region. So do a little work there. Smart Scale probably is a easier one to apply for. So that said, the timing is a bit challenging. However, under our franchise agreement with Dominion, they, at our request, do have to move those 2 poles at no cost to the city, plus whatever we need to make the lines work engineering-wise. So they could get out of the way in terms of access and sidewalks until we can come back and underground from the library to State Theater, which was the target scope area for this grant application.
Where would the poles go when you say get out of the way? Where would
Kind of more out into the right of way. So we do have a design where we'd widen the sidewalk, redo the entrance, but since we were already going to narrow the road there and shorten pedestrian crossing, we just moved the poles temporarily.
Takeaway is you're trying to sync up in some way the poles work with the library construction.
It's not within the library's budget, so we are keeping an eye on it from the transportation project.
Okay, good. And City Hall, I feel like the City Hall task force, mantle never fully leaves me. Are we going to have a, 3 or 6 month look back? Where are we? What did we run out of money to do that we really had hoped that we would do? Some good things have worked out with HIT, I heard, and maybe what's the likelihood of a status report on that in the early fall?
Right now, Mr. Shields and I are working on it in 2 kind of phases. The first phase will be a list of lessons learned that we are incorporating into the library project, so we can time it for your update on the library project for August 12th. That'll be at the high level lessons learned. And then in the fall, we will be working on the after action report, both financially and contractually. Right now we are just finishing the project and trying to get through the punch list and get the rest of our security. Tomorrow, since you brought up City Hall, dispatch starts the move back into City Hall, and 911 will be operational here on Wednesday. So we have Arlington and our mobile 911 on contingency, so we can make sure everything goes smoothly. They'll be back from the fire station. Fire station will remain as our secondary PSAP backup. And then sheriffs moved into their designated spot today because we finished the necessary security and IT. And HHS and court services moves from Gage House back to City Hall on Wednesday, Thursday. And right now, because of the lead time needed, we're looking at beginning of October for clerk of the court and courts to come back for the first court session. prior to that, but after all these moves, we'll do the contractual financial analysis.
And the Oak Street Bridge, you said you're having a meeting tomorrow, or
Yeah, the
something?
structural engineers
So
will be out on site tomorrow.
give us, we'll be out of commission now until August 12th, so you'll just handle notification of that. I would imagine people will begin to note, I mean, a lot of people are away on vacation now, they'll begin to notice that Oak Street is no longer a cut through from Route 7 to, Annandale, or, Route 50, so that's bound to have some impact.
Yep. And it will, I'm sure, be at least through this week, because even though they'll be on site inspecting tomorrow, we need to get the report back and look at whether we can reopen it, or as Mr. Whitfield indicated, possibly go to one lane.
Yeah, right, some other version. I talked to Mr. Whitfield before the meeting about the timing of the traffic signal at Southwest, so he's got a very long explanation that, I'll try to share with people who bring it up. We're waiting on a part.
Yep, we're waiting on parts. So it's a known issue, and they reprogram it, and just for the record, so everybody knows that when we lose power, it goes out, the programming is lost, and then we have to reset it till we get this new part in.
And finally, just to call everybody's attention back again to that number, those numbers that you cited, the VDOT's contingency number is now 40%. So whatever you think X is going to cost, add 40% as a contingency, and then a 5% annual escalator.
Yep.
I mean, that is an amazing number. It tells you how strong the economy is, that these people just don't need our work. And you have to consider that we're going to pay. I mean, is that environment true for building construction projects as well? Or is it just highways?
We are seeing, when we're looking at the library cost estimates and how we finish City Hall, some escalation. Of course, VDOT is, and our biggest large part of CIP is transportation, so that's been a heavy focus for us right now. But I think in some of the task orders and just the smaller facility projects, we're seeing some escalation when we have to have steel or concrete involved.
Mr. Lichtenhouse?
The Hawk signal on Haycock Road, is that at the existing crossing there? Across from Falls Plaza on Haycock Road?
Yes.
That's where that'll go, the existing crossing. Is there any way for us to paint a don't block the box turn into the high school? That's a consistent problem. There have been some accidents there.
Yeah.
Not to mention creating congestion. I know it won't be an issue after the new high school is built, but it's been raised several times by a couple different folks in the community. So that's a
Let me
request.
check with Robert and Mike on that.
Okay. And on this theme about proper resources being over budget, the first thing that drew my attention was the Herman Stream Valley Park, because I walk by that on a regular basis almost daily, and I've been watching that incomplete entry for months now. The spec problem with that and the installation, was that a city issue or was that a contractor issue?
We're still researching it a bit to see where the gap was. The problem is that the only entrance into that park for sanitary sewer maintenance work and repairs is through that, and it's 4 inches too small for our equipment. So Mike was researching the design versus the contract to see whose fault. So at this point, though, we're getting it done, and then we'll sort that out.
It goes back to some comments from other folks about I'd rather do a few projects really well, especially because I know we're still understaffed and we still don't have adequate resources. And we're, as much as we think we've gotten over the hump with the high school, it's still going to take a tremendous amount of time, everybody's time. And now we're contemplating, talking about embarking on the library, and City Hall was just, a hot mess in a lot of ways. So I want to make sure that if that's an indication that we still have problems, I want to make sure we revisit this and we don't spread ourselves too thin, so we're not having to come back and kick and scratch for additional funds.
We fully agree. I think some of it is just pacing it. We had so much pent up, and then we just couldn't manage it. Howard E. Herman, the Stream Valley Park, is When we first started doing the design of that entry, were probably 6 years ago, and we've had 3 project managers and a lot of turnover, so a lot of it was new staff. So until we say it's a design issue or a contract issue, I need to make sure that the current staff knew that Robert's equipment was X wide, because that's what we had specified, so. But that is just resources and continuity of knowledge and staff retention, which we had talked about during the staff
Contractor
process.
issue is found somebody else.
Yeah.
Not work with that person.
Yep.
All right. Any, so let me ask you, do we do our construction management, is that all in-house?
It's a mix depending on the project. We have brought in owner reps, so like right now for the library, so that we could start that while finishing City Hall. We brought in an owner rep, Markham's doing the
But I
construction
mean, other than the big
manager.
projects, is it essentially all in-house?
No, we will bring in inspectors and managers on some of the big transportation ones, so they're out there in the field constantly monitoring and, you know, testing the concrete and asphalt as it comes through and specs.
Not so much that, but just oversight. You know, obviously you're going to use someone to test your concrete slump or whatever. But I mean, in terms of actual construction management, so you say for the transportation, we will hire someone to be essentially an outside consultant who will watch over the project?
Yeah, so like the Roosevelt ones, when we did that whole interchange, we did bring in construction.
And how did that work out?
So far, I think we're finding transportation works pretty well once we get them up to speed on the scope, and so that we're all on the same page. The library one, because we brought somebody in early on, is working well. When we tried to bring an owner rep into the City Hall midstream to give support, there's just a lot of historical knowledge and understanding of the design was missing, and so that didn't work as well, and so we kept to the in-house. A hybrid works fine, but you still have to have the proper supervision of even your construction manager or owner rep.
Yeah, I mean, this would be a good time to get this down, you know, to figure out, because the library is going to be another big project, and I think just kind of figuring out what works and doesn't work, both from efficiency, quality, cost, et cetera, would be probably a good idea.
One of the things that Mike has done in Public Works to reorganize is we're going to have a CIP manager, because before we had a lot of project managers that were engineers, but we needed somebody who had more expertise and oversight to help provide that support. And then if we bring in an owner rep or construction manager, that person's overseeing them versus the PM overseeing the outsource. So we've got some refinements going. I think we'll always be a hybrid.
And have a big Chimneys Park. What's the status? Like, I've read what's there, but in terms of, are you about to sign a GMP at the number we talked about at the meeting when we agreed on this?
The construction is scheduled to start this fall. They're finalizing the contract award.
But you anticipate it'll be in the amount that we agreed upon? Okay. All right. Okay.
That is one that got into the queue, although we've added the money and the $350,000 will
I remember
help.
that part.
You know, the scoping, that's a good example where the scoping didn't have enough escalation for the complexities of the project and the time delays.
Got it. I just want to make sure our complexities didn't keep going. All
As
right.
it stands right now, yes, sir.
Okay. Are there any other comments on CIP? If not, we'll go on to scheduling and council requests and comments. Are there any scheduling requests or comments from anyone? All right, doesn't sound like there are. That's it. For whenever you want to have it, we'll have one. I'm pretty much, I'm like the whatever guy. So, you go for the Saturday Night Live skit. It's probably, anyway, I'll tell you what. It's probably before you were born. Yeah.
I just want you. Oh, well, let's move on.
All right. All right.
A couple different times. The sidewalk from Timber to Seaton on Jackson.
I'm going to go out there with some spackle and fix that.
It's crazy. We've solved smaller problems than that one. and I have tripped on it myself. I'm embarrassed to say, but it is a hazard. And I think Wyatt has said that the guy that grinds the sidewalks may be done for the year, but he wasn't sure. I'd like to know, and I would like to have that resolved before school starts in the fall. It's two spots? It's 2 spots really on either side of the stormwater manhole, if I recall correctly. But we had somebody else on the pause trail lose a tooth, a kid trip on one of those similar, but this is an additional section that's heavily trafficked that we need to grind down.
Let me check into that.
All right, anything else, or should we?
Oh, no, we're not done yet.
Go on. What do you got?
The vegetation behind the former Rite Aid is now taking on dystopian dimensions. I mean, it's really spectacular. You know, there's like 5-foot weeds growing up out of the sidewalk, and not to mention, you know, the area that needs to be mowed and so forth. And it's not going to get any better because nobody's in charge. So I think the city's going to have to mow it and send them a bill. Hopefully, I'll lose track of that while we're away.
Okay.
The Economic Development Committee is planning to meet Thursday, August the 1st, 10 o'clock. I just want the mayor to know that somebody out in cyber world has just tweeted a picture of a council member in the double glasses look.
Yeah.
I don't even know who.
For false shirts?
I don't know. I don't even know who the guy is. So I'm apparently
Set a fashion trend.
becoming famous.
I like it.
Infamous.
I like it. That's right. Okay. Anything else? If not, why don't we go ahead and adjourn?
And we will see you August 12th.
Sounds good. All right. Thank you, everybody.